Josh Paigen is a specialist in male fertility and the founder of Mandrake Health. Josh combines his training as a nutrition coach with extensive research in the fields of paternal coding, developmental origins of health and disease, epigenetic inheritance, and biological aging to deliver fertility boosting, epigenetically optimized lifestyle programs for men looking to become fathers, aka male fertility coaching. The top 5 topics we explore are the paradigm shift in understanding male fertility and the impact of preconception health on future generations, the importance of optimizing health and vitality for fertility, the significant role of epigenetics and DNA methylation in gene expression, the role of environmental toxins in fertility and gender identity, the importance of making optimal lifestyle choices for fertility and overall well-being. This is Christian, and you found True North, a podcast that's equal parts sense-making, soul-searching, and storytelling. If you resonate with this project, please subscribe on your platform of choice, leave us 5 stars, and share it with a friend. It's the best zero-cost way to allocate your support, and it helps us bring high-value guests on the show. Plus, with every new sub we get, the Alliance gains strength, and the Empire weakens. Hit subscribe, Obi-Wan. You are our only hope. Check out truenorthproject.com for all the links and enjoy this conversation with Josh Paigen. Sweet. So Josh, thanks for being here, man. I'm stoked to dive in with you today about all things male fertility.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Yeah, man. It's really weird that you actually, first that we connected at all, kind of randomly in Paonia when I was there last summer. We had a kind of chance encounter and then had a great conversation. And then you reached out and emailed me about this fertility coaching you're doing pretty much as I was starting my own sort of exploratory dive down into the weeds with fertility because I'm planning on trying to conceive a child this year. And so that was a thing that I was just about to tackle. In fact, I was already planning that process. And then I got this email from you. It's super strange. So all that is to say, stoked to have you on the podcast and to talk to you about something that you clearly seem pretty psyched and passionate about. Do you want to let people know sort of a little bit about your background, how you got into coaching men on fertility, and sort of, just give them a little bit of a window into your world?
Sure, absolutely. I will say that you're a rare breed, Christian, in looking ahead to the future before you get there in terms of the male fertility preconception prep. It's not common really for men to take that proactive approach. So kudos to you on that. I was trained as a nutrition coach to support oncology patients. And so a lot of that work was grounded in functional medicine and really working to figure out the additional stressors that lifestyle could be contributing towards the cancering process. And so that really opened my eyes to functional medicine and blood labs and nutrigenomic testing. And so kind of working in that space, I started to become aware of just kind of like the myriad of different health risks and benefits and triggers and preventative medicine. And as I was going through that work, I was also kind of in your position where I was like, okay, I'm going to start to have a family, I hope soon, and I want to conceive. And I think same as you kind of had an inkling of it'd probably be good for me to optimize to a certain extent, but I don't know how. And so because I was working directly in the nutrition space, working with functional labs, I just decided I'm going to start running these functional labs on myself and on my wife. And my sister-in-law is also a nutritional therapist. So she had access to even some more hormonal labs that I didn't have access to at the time. And so my wife and I started going through these labs and recognizing that while we thought we were super healthy and we felt fairly healthy, felt great, there were kind of some inconsistencies and some imbalances that we could work to address. And so kind of with some of my mentors' coaching and just kind of encouragement, I started to go down the path of health optimization, looking at it through the lens of these functional lab lab analyses that I was doing. And my wife and I spent about 10 months really working to dial in our lab ranges and become functionally healthy, essentially, from a lab point of view. And then that personal experience and the power of it and everything I learned along the way really opened my eyes to kind of the fertility crisis, the male fertility crisis, what's going on with our hormones and health optimization and the power of preconception health and all these different aspects of the work I do now. And so I decided to kind of capsule it all up and shift my focus away from oncology patients and shift it towards preconception preparation, and chose really to focus on men because I feel like they're underserved and they're half the equation.
Yeah. Okay. So just I'm going to ask some questions, and some of them might sound like silly because I'm just trying to get build some common terminology and some stuff that I don't quite understand.
That's great.
So
That's great.
what is oncology?
So oncology is cancer treatment.
Gotcha. So
So
basically,
that's working
instead
with
of
people. Yeah,
sorry to cut you off. So instead of helping or focusing on people kind of at the point where they've already got issues, you're now kind of moving more in the direction of how to focus on optimizing health prior to uh, like preventative style sort of approach. Does that make sense?
absolutely. And in the work I was doing and continually learning more and more about in the oncology nutrition space, it's a combination of functional blood labs to assess where you are now, and this is all adjunct support. So this is not a different treatment than radiation or chemotherapy, but adjunct support to those allopathic treatments, those standard Western medical treatments. And so in that process of supporting patients, really started to analyze also really detailed health histories and recognize that there are potential for cancer triggers that can occur very young in life. And when you start to rewind that all the way back, it looks like actually some of those triggers could be occurring in the preconception time phase. So preconception time phase being, generally considered the 3 to 9 months before you conceive, before the point of conception.
So just to make sure I'm clear on that, are you saying that the impact of, say, someone in utero or before they're even conceived, the health of their parents is now having downstream effects on their health later on in life, potentially increasing risk of cancer and such? Or am I missing that?
You're getting it, and
Okay.
the exact science of how it works is still being uncovered. And it's not only cancer; it's things like diabetes, it's things like heart disease, and so these are generally considered currently to be epigenetic inheritance traits or aspects of epigenetic inheritance. And so epigenetics, we can dive into that a little bit later in terms of what that is and unpack that whole
Yeah.
scenario. But essentially, there's a theory. It's called the developmental origins of health and disease, pioneered by this guy, David Barker. It was initially called the Barker hypothesis. And he was really focused on in utero effects of, linking low birth rate, or low birth weight to increased risk of different non-communicable diseases. So heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, things like that. And so there's a huge nourishing component, a nutrition component there of like how the baby's nourished in utero, how they're nourished for the first few years of their life. And kind of that work was really, some of that work was really started to then pay attention to the preconception time period and recognize that there is some sort of epigenetic transfer of health status that can occur through. And so there's, different studies, animal-based and human-based, that kind of highlight some of the different aspects of that.
Okay. So I want to frame this up a little bit for people, including myself, but there seems to be a bit of a paradigm shift happening in the way of how we see fertility, genetics, and epigenetics, and this relationship between our health and what we pass on to future generations, to our offspring. And I say it feels like a paradigm shift because I grew up, and I don't know if it was just because I grew up under a rock, but I grew up with the idea that fertility was more about, it was almost like a binary. It was like a yes no thing. It's like you're either able to have children or you're not. And then, if there's genetic problems, those seems to be, or they in my mind, they were seen more as almost unavoidable issues that they were sort of just baked into the cake. And
Sure.
now there's this more nuanced perspective, which is something more along the lines of like fertility is more of a spectrum. And, you can have, in other words, it's not just about if you can conceive, it's also about the quality of your genetics and that genetic material, making sure it's not, damaged in any way, making sure you're not passing on any sort of maladies or issues, and that you're actually, you could be able to have a child but still be on the low end of the kind of health spectrum and not necessarily be doing that child any favors. So let's unpack that a little bit about how fertility functions, and how we actually, and how our state of health, our vitality, is actually very related to what the health of future generations. And you're saying even to the point where it can lead to things like cancer, increased risks of cancer and stuff like that. So preconceptions actually, from the time of preconception, you said like 3 to 9 months.
I mean, theoretically, preconception's your entire life before you conceive, but generally it's considered, the 3 to 12 months before you
Right.
conceive as the most, applicable time to implement lifestyle changes.
Right. So you're in this, like me, for example, I fall into that boat of, if I end up conceiving, I'm in that boat of preconception, within a year of actually conceiving a child. And so I'm trying to think more consciously about my lifestyle and about how I'm setting myself up so that, we can get into spermatogenesis and all this stuff, but like how my genetic material is, like the state of it as I'm conceiving a child and what I'm actually passing on there. So yeah, let's kind of dive in.
Sure. So I too very much think of fertility as a spectrum. So 0 being you're dead and 100 being optimal health, and maybe, the ability to conceive a child somewhere in the 30 to 40 range. So just because you can conceive a child doesn't mean that you're conceiving with optimal sperm quality or with, the optimal health attributes that maybe you could be passing on to your child. And the way that those health attributes would be inherited by your child is generally not through an epigenetic inheritance. So the genes are fairly baked in. So if you have some sort of genetic predisposition, the work I'm doing is not any sort of genetic manipulation. We're not changing genetic material. We're just working to use diet and lifestyle to change the epigenome. And so epigenome is epigenetics, and epi means above or on top of. And so this is essentially the layer of interface between your cells and your genes and the rest of your body, the way that the cells kind of come to life. So it affects genetic expression, which genes are turned on and which genes are turned off. And there's a few different epigenetic mechanisms that essentially turn genes on or turned off. And as you say, when you grew up, it was widely assumed that essentially you went back to 0, you just got the genes that you inherited and you started from scratch. And so it was long believed that at the point of conception, essentially the 2 pairs of chromosomes come together and there was a giant demethylation event. This is, we'll dive into demethylation and methylation in just a minute, but essentially it wiped clean all of the lifestyle experience, all of the health kind of that you would have had, the health history essentially that you would have had. It would have been wiped clean at the point of conception. This is the previous understanding. And then from the point of conception on, that child or that fetus then developed their own set of epigenetic markers. And what they're finding is that, and more research coming out every year, especially out of New Zealand and stuff, is finding increased percentage of epigenetic marks are retained past the point of conception. And so essentially epigenetic marks turn genes on or off. And so genes can be, kind of labeled good or bad. It's a very rough estimate, but some genes are tumor suppressant genes or pro-anti-inflammatory genes, or there can be pro-inflammatory genes or pro-tumor genes. And in general, as we age, what are considered more bad genes are turned on, and when the good genes, the tumor suppressant genes and the pro-anti-inflammatory genes are turned off. And so it's likely that some of your epigenetic marks on your genome are being passed through the point of conception, and your child is inheriting that, which could potentially change the way that their genes are expressing. So it's not changing their genes, but it's changing which genes are acting on their biology.
Yeah,
So
and
there's a lot of layers there, so I can unpack any of them. But is that making any sort of sense?
it's
Or?
starting to a little bit. Yeah, so I think what I'm hearing is that you have sort of this base layer, which is your genes, your genetics, that's more hard coded in. But then there's more of a superficial, kind of more malleable layer called epigenetics, which is kind of how those genes are expressing. And that is very much impacted by things like lifestyle and environment, right? So your epigenetics are something that can kind of, if I'm understanding this correctly, change over time, whereas the genes kind of below that are consistent. And if you and what you're saying is that the evidence is starting to show that there's high likelihood that we're able to transfer epigenetic sort of signatures onto our like there's an epigenetic residue that goes along with conception and conceiving a child, and that can be negative in the sense that in some cases it could be negative if the epigenetics are, I guess, causing genes to express in a non-optimal way. Does that track?
Yeah, that's it. I can give you a more clear example that's directly out of a scientific study. So this is one of like kind of the landmark epigenetic studies. It's called the agouti mouse study. It's circa 2008. And so essentially there's these agouti mice, and they have a gene that causes them to be overweight and yellow. So they have a yellow coat, and they're obese, essentially. They're much larger than a standard mouse. And they find and they specify one single gene called they name it the agouti gene, and then they supplement the mice. They supplement the pregnant mothers of the mice. And through the supplementation, they're able to change the way that those genes are expressed. And they essentially turn off the agouti gene using only dietary supplementation, so that the subsequent offspring of the fat yellow mice have the fat yellow gene silenced, and their offspring are small and gray or mottled coat. And subsequent studies then came to find that not only was that effect occurring through in utero epigenetic transfer, but that it was occurring through germline epigenetic transfer, and that multiple generations would retain the small gray stature for multiple generations, like essentially 3 to 4 generations, and then that methylation mark would start to wear off without consistent supplementation, and the mice would then over multiple generations return to being fat yellow mice. So it's not changing the genes, but it can turn off specific genes in a way that could be advantageous.
And in this example, advantageous. In other examples, it could also be disadvantageous, right? Like an epigenetic change or something that you're passing on epigenetically could actually turn on a problematic expression of a gene, right? That's what you were saying about like increased risk of heart disease or cancer and things of that nature, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You could go either direction. And so the direction that I come at it from is really looking to find what I call the Goldilocks zone. And I think you can get that term. It's the golden mean. Essentially, it's like the sweet spot of hyper or hypomethylation. So maybe I'll just dive into talking about methylation a bit so you can get an understanding. There's essentially 3 mechanisms of epigenetic transfer. So these are way that genes are expressed. DNA methylation is the primary form that's studied and most well understood in the scientific community. There's also something called histone modification. So histones are the proteins that the DNA wraps around. And so by changing the size of those proteins, you essentially wrap the DNA tighter or looser, and a more tightly wound packet of DNA tends not to express the genes as well as a more loosely wrapped. And so changes in the histone size can change the way those genes are expressed. And then there's also non-coding RNA, but that's probably a little bit too much for your audience. I'm just going to dive into the DNA methylation. That's the most widely understood form of epigenetic transfer. Essentially, your body generates methyl groups, which is a carbon and 3 hydrogen. And those groups, methylation is occurring as a biological process throughout your body all the time. But DNA methylation is when a methyl group attaches onto your DNA strand. And so the attachment of a methyl group onto your DNA strand can either silence or turn on a gene, and that happens to hyper or hypomethylation. If there's a ton of methyl groups on there, it's called hypermethylation, and that silences the gene expression. And if there's a lack of methyl groups, then generally that gene is then expressed because there's like an opening for it to express itself.
Just to frame that a little bit more, what is the process of methylation and why is it happening? Can you
So
speak to that?
methylation is a constant biological process that goes on inside your body. It's just churning all the time. And so essentially when you eat nutrients, there's certain nutrients in your diet that are considered methyl donors. So these are really critical essential nutrients like folate, betaine, choline, and B12. These are like kind of the top 4 methyl donors. And when you eat these, your body is able to use the nutrients from these nutrients, and it basically plugs it into a methylation cycle that's occurring inside your body. And that basically takes methionine and converts it into S-adenosyl methionine, which is CME. You've heard of CME. It's the universal methyl donor. And in that process, it spits out a methyl group, which is the carbon and 3 hydrogen. So that's how your body generates methyl groups, is through this methylation cycle where you eat these nutrients, these essentially 4 essential nutrients that are methyl donors. It combines, it gets input into the cycle. Methionine converts into S-adenosyl methionine, which then gets converted into homocysteine and S-adenosyl homocysteine. And those 4 essentially just whirring all the time. It's like a little engine. And you keep putting in the nutrients, and the engine keeps spitting out methyl groups. And then you utilize those methyl groups, and they get transported around your body to kind of like turn genes on and off.
So yeah, it's interesting. It's almost like discovering a new language when you start talking to somebody about like biology in a way that, it's for me, it's not quite 100% Greek, but it's mostly Greek. And so I'm trying to like unpack it for myself and for others listening.
Sure.
But
yeah.
I know my experience with nutrition and my knowledge of methylation just comes from finding out, visiting a functional medicine doctor and finding out that there was a particular nutrient that my body has a hard time methylating, I guess, if that's the right way to say it. So
probably folate. You have MTHFR probably, and it's like a folate thing.
I don't know if it was folate or if it was vitamin D or something. But basically, I think it was vitamin D. But basically, I was prescribed a type of or not prescribed, but recommended that I take a supplement because my body had a harder time absorbing vitamin D or something. And I think it had to do with the methylation. But my point is to say that like, if you're having issues with that methylation, then yeah, you would need to potentially supplement in order to solve that issue. Is that correct?
That's true. And MTHFR is a common genetic kind of a SNP, so a single nucleotide polymorphism. It's an aspect of your genes that can predispose a large portion of the population actually to an inability to kind of like integrate folate as well. And so those people with MTHFR generally would need to supplement folate. And I want to stress here that I would recommend supplementing with folate and not folic acid. And so for many years, there's a lot of kind of like enriched, especially like wheat products that are enriched with folic acid. Folic acid does not engage with your biopathways, your biological pathways, the same way that folate does. In fact, it can have detrimental effects. And so that's kind of like science that's come out, but hasn't really hit the mainstream yet. And they say there's about a 17-year delay between science in the labs and studies reaching the mainstream and the medical office. So definitely want to put that in there of like, don't go for the folic acid enriched foods and instead supplement with like a 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate or some sort of bioavailable folate form.
My partner is currently supplementing with some prenatals that include methylated folate. So it's that's the kind that you're speaking about, I think. But that's mind bending that the average is 17 years, and hopefully that lag time is reducing with the internet and with
that's my goal.
People like Andrew Huberman in the world, and you.
Yeah, absolutely. Andrew Huberman's a good one on that. He helps it happen.
Yeah, for sure. So basically, just to summarize, we've got this like epigenetic thing going on, and one of the key ways that I guess epigenetic pathways is methylation. Is that the wrong way of saying it? Okay.
Yep. Key mechanisms is methylation.
Yep. Okay. And you said there was 2 others.
The other 2 are histone modification. So those are the proteins that the DNA wraps around, and non-coding RNA. So that's an aspect of the RNA in the gene trying to recreate itself.
Got it.
And so, and then there's different kind of like pathways for this epigenetic inheritance, there's essentially in utero epigenetic inheritance, which is occurring when the baby's inside the mother. And so the epigenetic marks are getting transferred from the mother into the baby while the baby's in utero.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's biosocial. And so this is kind of this idea that it's kind of the long running nature nurture debate. I like to think of epigenetics as kind of the nature nurture nexus, where it's like the integration of both nature and nurture. Biosocial epigenetic inheritance essentially means that the way you're raised predisposes you to raise your children that way, but that there's a biological component to that as well. And it's primarily through animal studies, but it essentially shows that rat mothers essentially who care for their young, they're called licking grooming dames, who care for their young in a really nurturing environment, change the neurochemistry of the children. And that change in neurochemistry kind of affects the way that those subsequent generations are raised and who they become, and then in turn affects how they raise their children. And so it's not just like a nurture thing getting nurture. Like the nurture affects the nature, and then the nature comes back and affects the nurture, and it goes back and forth. And then the third way is germline. And so this is the idea that epigenetic marks can pass through the germ cells being the oocyte and the sperm, the two sex cells of the male and female. And that epigenetic inheritance can actually occur past the point of conception.
Past the point of conception, meaning, okay, so unpack that for me with the germline, because I was following the previous conversation around biosocial and the nexus of nature nurture. That makes a lot of sense to me, just intuitively. But when you're saying epigenetics passing through the germline, what do you mean that last bit about post-conception?
So this is what I kind of touched on before, where for a long time it was assumed that essentially any epigenetic marks on the sperm or the egg, so this would be like sperm DNA methylation, the DNA methylation marks on the sperm, at the point of conception, it was long assumed that there was a mass demethylation event and all those marks were wiped clear. And what science is beginning to show is that some percentage of those marks remain. And there's even emerging science that suggests that there is a mass demethylation event, and that after the point of conception, there's somehow a memory that reinstills the marks in the exact same fashion, even though they were initially wiped clear, in a way that's not completely fully understood still. And so this is just the idea that the marks on the epigenetic marks on the sperm and the egg at the point of conception, some percentage of them pass through. There's some research coming out of the University of Otago in New Zealand that suggests as much as 30%, but it's still a scientific debate, essentially, of how much of the epigenetic marks gets passed through the point of conception.
Okay, so I'm going to try to do my best to translate this to not biological nerd speak and bring it down into like everyday language.
Great, yeah. I mean, we can drop all the science and just I can share with your audience what I'm all about too.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. It's cool. You've clearly got a deep reservoir of knowledge in this domain, which is rad. I'm glad that we're having this conversation. But I've also learned over time that if it's not communicated to people in such a way that is in jargon and language and lingo that they understand, then they sort of just tune out. And so
100%.
What this means, I think, and I'd love, your take on this, but I think what this all implies is that your health, your vitality, your genetic health, you're just basically the whole health stack, of your biological health and how you're functioning at the time of conceiving a child is fucking critical in the future health of your children. And the idea that, obviously we knew this to a certain degree, like, oh, don't smoke while you're pregnant, but that's not quite conception. That's later, right? That's in utero. Right. So there's this kind of idea that, oh yeah, if you're pregnant, then things can transfer, through from the mother to the child. So yeah, mothers shouldn't drink while they're pregnant or whatever, smoke and whatnot. But this is actually expanding beyond just that. And it's saying the health of your jizz as a dude, the health of your sperm is critical and it's like 50% of the equation, literally. And so, and then the health of the eggs and the health of just that genetic information that's coming together has a big impact that can have downstream effects that can impact the child's health, fertility. There are all kinds of different things, and we'll talk about environmental, um, you know, pollutants and forever chemicals and phthalates and things that are actually impacting, children's gender and, masculinization and things of that nature. But basically, just to make it super clear, there is a lot, it's fascinating, the science behind this and the process, but just to make it super clear, you actually do have an impact on the health and the outcome of your child based on how you are when you conceive the child, right?
That is absolutely true, and it's not only epigenetics. So there's, as the paternal age increases, essentially, I think it's increased about 3.5 years or something over the last 40 years or something like that. Maybe even something along those lines. I think we're at about an average age of 31 for paternal age now.
And so parents are getting older. So guys are waiting longer to have kids. And
people
so
are choosing to have kids longer, and there is a really strong correlation. I think it's widely or has long been assumed by men, like, oh, I can procreate until I'm 80, 90, 100, like it's all the same. And I think there's a really clear understanding that women's fertility declines, and then there's menopause. And the reality of it is that men's fertility also declines, not for everyone and not at the same rate. But, as men age, men over 40 are more prone to have an autistic child. And there's other, psychological risk profiles that their children may be more predisposed to because of their advanced paternal age. So advanced paternal age is just over 40, essentially. And so I really believe that there are things that we can do to essentially rewind the clock, change our biological age, which is another thing we can dive into. Biological age and epigenetics are closely intertwined, but essentially the younger you can make your body and the healthier you can be, the more vitality you have, essentially you're instilling all of those benefits for reducing the risk of things like autism, essentially, because you can be essentially like rewinding your biological clock.
Right. So you're kind of, if you think about it in terms of, I don't know why this is coming up for me right now, but there's kind of, there's a Chinese way of looking at it, which is, I forgot the words. One of them's qi or chi, but basically you have like your reservoir of life force energy, and then which is kind of fixed. And eventually it's like, okay, you have so many breaths and heartbeats that you can have or whatever. But then there's another type of energy, which is more of the quality of your current state. And that's just kind of a metaphor as to say, you have this sort of baked in genetic fertility. Like there's a glass ceiling of, there's an actual, you're not going to be as fertile at 80 as you are at 20. Right. So there's kind of a biologically fixed, constraint on fertility, and it's a spectrum, once again, that sort of peaks when you're very young, usually, in your, I would imagine fertility is peaking between like 18 and 30 for most people, somewhere in there.
Yeah, 18, 25, somewhere in there. Yeah.
Right. And so after it peaks, it's just kind of slowly downhill from there. But then in addition to that, at any age, no matter how much fixed kind of fertility factor you have, you still have this variance that's dependent on your health, your current state of health. So I guess the takeaway is get as healthy as possible if you're trying to conceive, right? Which is the big if here. It's the question. It's like, obviously, if you're tuning into a podcast about fertility, then you're somewhat curious or maybe planning on conceiving. So there's two takeaways from me. One is, don't wait if you're trying to have children, because the longer you wait, well, I shouldn't say don't wait. Like if you're young, be responsible and it's a very important decision. Don't rush into it. But basically, don't put it off forever, because you will get less fertile over time. And then the second takeaway is very intentionally approach that moment of conception. And we'll talk about how to do that in a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are companies. Legacy is a big one that's come out recently that offers like cryogenic freezing for sperm. If you're like, I want to nail this super high quality, healthy sperm when I'm at 24, but I don't want to have kids till I'm 38, you can cryogenically freeze your sperm now so that you're getting the highest quality sperm theoretically when you're ready for it. But the other aspect of what you're talking about is really, if you're tuning in, we assume you're somewhat interested in fertility, but really there's a growing number of scientists and doctors and stuff who recognize fertility metrics parameters essentially as the sixth vital sign. And so essentially, it's a giant, great bellwether for your overall health. And so even if you're not having a kid or don't want to have a kid, I would still recommend going and getting a baseline sperm analysis, or considering it at least, to really get a biomarker, a tracker of where's my baseline health at. And I think Huberman talks on this in his podcast about fertility being the ultimate kind of meeting between vitality and longevity. Like, you can optimize vitality and you can optimize longevity, but if you want to optimize both, focus on optimizing fertility. And that's really, I think, paramount and important for people to understand.
For sure. I got the quote actually right here, which I stole from your website, which is, they're a subset of biological rules and mechanisms that, when aligned, allow us to maximize both our vitality and our longevity. And I think it's fair to say that all those mechanisms and tools are housed in the discussion around maximizing fertility. So that's Andrew Huberman. So yeah, it's like, as you say, the six vital signs. So just talk to me like I'm five. What are the other five vital signs? I would imagine like heart rate and blood pressure important.
Heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate, VO2 max, I think is one of them, or VO2, maybe not max. I guess I don't know them all. Heart rate, blood pressure.
Right. So basically VO2 would just be an indicator of your cardiovascular health.
It's not VO2 max, but it's like your respiratory rate. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So basically it's super important to track the markers of fertility. So what are the key markers of fertility I don't know if you want to make this specific to males, but just what are the key metrics that we would be looking at for tracking fertility?
Sure. I mean, from a sperm test point of view for men, the most basic way that male fertility is tested is through a sperm test. So a comprehensive sperm test. This is going to test motility, which is what percentage of the sperm are moving. Morphology, which is the shape of the sperm, what percentage of the sperm are normally or abnormally shaped. It's going to test count, so total sperm count. It's going to test concentration, so how many sperm per milliliter, and it's going to test volume of seminal fluid. And that's kind of like the baseline sperm analysis. And then there's additional tests that you could stack on that are more expensive, that are things like DNA fragmentation. So DNA fragmentation is going to be a measure of the genetic errors in your sperm sample, essentially. And so DNA fragmentation tends to increase as men get older. It can also increase from heat, oxidative stress, a whole number of different nutritional reasons. But essentially, it's a marker of how much genetic error is in any sample of sperm. And then there's also like an oxidative stress test. And so there's kind of some more comprehensive tests. But the base is count, volume, shape, and movement.
So can you have, like, say, a sperm sample that everything looks great, swimmers look healthy, the count and motility and everything looks great, but then you could get the deeper dive test and find out that you've got a bunch of DNA fragmentation that, are they related? Like, is it likely to have DNA fragmentation if your sperm sample is looking great?
It is possible to have DNA fragmentation with all of your other markers in the normals, in the green zones. And essentially there's what's called idiopathic fertility, which essentially where both partners are go through the standard fertility test and there's no known cause. Essentially, it's unexplained infertility. It's actually more common than you think, where the labs run all the tests, both partners, everything's totally fine, and yet 3, 4, 5 years go by and they're unable to conceive naturally. And so in general, things like DNA fragmentation or oxidative stress tests are the next layer that would be brought in. And if those are then testing normally, that's where you would like the DNA, I said DNA fragmentation, but then the next step would be to look at the epigenetic, like DNA methylation, which is cost prohibitive really from a consumer standpoint. But that's where you really want to start fine tuning your diet and reducing chronic inflammation.
Okay. So I guess if we're going through the sort of hierarchy of optimization of fertility from the level of, do this first, then this if necessary type of thing, right?
Yeah.
I would imagine the first thing you want to do is just optimize your lifestyle, and your environment, so that you're creating the best conditions for healthy sperm. We can talk about the spermatogenesis cycle and how long it takes to actually create sperm, because that's going to impact your plans for conception as well. In other words, once you
Yeah.
make adjustments to your lifestyle and environment to improve sperm quality, you're going to want to give yourself quite a bit of time, maybe 60, 70 days, I think, is the spermatogenesis time. So somewhere between 2 and 3 months, you're probably going to want to give yourself to actually let those effects kick in, so that your essentially new sperm will be better off. And then, so what would be the next layers? I mean, should you do the sperm analysis regardless, or should you do the lifestyle change, then do the sperm analysis prior to trying?
It really depends kind of on how serious you want to take this and how deep you want to dive, and also kind of how much you want to spend on this optimization. Sperm tests, depending on how comprehensive, are in the $100 to $200 range for an at-home sperm test. The cheaper versions obviously don't give you as many parameters. And so as I approached this whole experience, I wasn't in the whole data realm. I wasn't trying to gather a bunch of data. I just was like, I just need to optimize. And so I'm just going to run blood labs and hormone labs. And so that's what I did. I think the very basic is just like dial in your, I'd be happy to share on this podcast. I also offer a program on our website and stuff, but just like dial in your fertility health as a man to the point where your body's humming and you're feeling super dialed and healthy. And if you want to say like how much DNA fragmentation do I have and what has my lifestyle done to improve it, then I'd recommend getting the test at the beginning, doing the lifestyle changes, and getting a second test before you conceive, so that you can like validate your improvement if that's important to you as someone who likes to track data. I totally understand if it is. If that's you, Christian, maybe you'd want to get the sperm test before the lifestyle changes. For me, I think the most important thing is like implement the lifestyle changes and then try to conceive. And I really believe that we can dive deep down like the functional rabbit hole of trying to nail every single parameter, but there's also a sense, I think, that people have intuitively of like when they're feeling really, really healthy.
Yeah.
And I think that it's not always true for everyone. Maybe some people have never felt it. I know there were many years where I didn't feel it, and going through this process of preconception prep was the first time I tasted it, and it's addictive. This whole process changed my life because it just changed who I am, and not only my job and my career, but also like my addiction to health.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's I think, just like optimize your lifestyle, optimize your health, try to conceive. In general, depends on your age, and the time to conception changes as people get older. In general, if you try to conceive for 6 months and you're under 35, and try to conceive for 6 months and you're unsuccessful, that's considered subfertility. And then if you try to conceive for 12 months and you're unsuccessful with a natural conception, that's considered infertility. That definition has recently been changed this year, actually, to be more inclusive of
in other words,
gender.
we're using softer language now.
We're using softer language. It's a more inclusive definition that basically says if you need to use any sort of donor sperm or donor eggs, or you're unable to conceive naturally, you're infertile, which is essentially a way of opening up the definition to include more people. But so I think, try for 6 months. I wouldn't try for 12 months personally. I would try to optimize, try for a max 6. And if you're not nailing it in 6, I would like double down, get the tests, and then like start running again.
So just to unpack that a little bit, from my understanding from spending a decade of my life on the Huberman Lab podcast. Not just kidding. Like his fertility podcast is so long. And he's got a few of them now. So I think I spent like probably around 15 hours of just listening to Huberman and his guests just for this. And then I read Shauna Swan's book as well, which is terrifying. We'll talk about, but basically,
absolutely.
There's a you were just, what was the idea I was about to share? So you were just saying about, trying for 6 months. So basically the reason why is because there's sort of a probability, even if you've got max fertility and you're very healthy, human reproductive cycle isn't super efficient compared to all animals. So basically it could take several ovulatory cycles, an ovulatory cycle just being, a monthly cycle, roughly monthly, could be like 20 to 40 days for a woman. But it's just the cycle, but the process by which an egg is being produced or leaving the vault, right? Where the ovaries are producing eggs or whatever. If they're leaving the vault and traveling down to the uterus and kind of setting up camp and waiting for the arrival of the invaders to come in and plant their genetic seeds, right? So basically you've got this ovulatory cycle, and if you time it perfectly and you try for conception and you get sperm in there during the exact window where it's optimal, you're still only at like 20%. 20%.
If you're under 35, essentially.
Yeah. So even if you're in a young age and you've got, you're a healthy person, you're still not like 100% likely to get pregnant the first try. So, they say give it 6 months, because 6 times 20%, you're basically giving yourself an accumulative probability that within 6 tries, you should have probably seen some results by now if you're healthy.
That's correct.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So,
thanks for clarifying that. You nailed it.
Thanks, man. I'm doing my best here. I'm trying to keep up.
Yeah,
but
great. Appreciate it.
But basically, I'm just trying to even when I understand it, I'm trying to unpack a little bit so I can bring everyone along with us, because I think it's super important to understand. I don't think there's a lot of, there is now, thanks to guys like Huberman and the internet, but especially where I grew up, there was very little in the way of sexual health education, right? And
absolutely,
I grew up
next to none.
I know it's not even specific to where I grew up, but I grew up in an especially small place where there's not a lot of talk around that kind of stuff at all. And so this is kind of been a expansive experience for me just in the study phase of this fertility journey, learning about kind of the wondrous biological mystery that is human reproduction. It's kind of bizarre and magical in some sense. Like when you start to understand how much variability and how much there's all these tiny steps along the journey that are all impacted by these kind of complex releases of different hormones and things like that. And so there's this crazy sort of cascade of things that occurs just to get an egg into a uterus and get it ready to go. I mean, that egg's been selected, and then also, what is it? The follicle. What's it called? Follicle. There's a component where there's another stage where just like one of many is chosen. You know what I mean? And it's like there's these filters, and then so you end up with this kind of very interesting, complex combination. The combinatorics of it are bizarre when you think about the one sperm, the one egg, and all of that happening. It's pretty magical. So
magic for sure. You nailed it on the magic word for sure. It's incredible. There's a lot of room for things to get disrupted. Mm-hmm. Definitely kind of where the endocrine disrupting chemicals come in, but there's many other things that can disrupt that cycle, and it's really important to nail the hormone balance. And so, as you say, like all these different hormone cascades trigger different aspects of the spermatogenesis cycle, or for the woman, like the egg development. And so spermatogenesis, just for your audience, is the formation of sperm. Mm-hmm. So that's how sperm are formed in the testes. Mm-hmm. But essentially, it's a crazy miracle that we came to be, given how many different variables there are in that whole process.
Yeah, and I would, instead of trying to unpack the whole process, I'm just going to point people to Huberman Lab, and he has a 4-hour deep dive on basically fertility and how the whole process works, and I'll link to that in the show notes. But
great.
Yeah, so it's a fucking mystery. If you're wanting to become a parent, you should check out that podcast for sure, and just know that it's a rabbit hole. But I want to go into another rabbit hole, which is kind of the dark side of this. We've talked about, biology, and sort of why it's important to be thinking about your health and your environment well, we haven't talked as much about environment, but we've been talking about just sort of that your biological health, both your age and your current state of health, are super key factors in determining not just if you can conceive, but the quality of that child in some sense. Like it sounds kind of sterile or weird to say quality of a human, like that they don't all have unique value, but every parent, I would imagine, wants to set their children up as best as they can. And if you could say you had a lever to, you had some sort of inputs that you could control that gave you better outputs. For example, if I could lower the risk of autism or Down syndrome or any of these other, gender issues or anything like that, then I'm going to do my best. I would hope most parents would want to do their best. So it's just, we've covered that, and it's important to know that it matters. And then now let's talk about how.
I just want to add one thing there before we go on. I just want to add one thing. Absolutely, you can change the risk profile and health trajectory of your future children, and the quality of your sperm and your egg and your fertility health can also have a huge effect on your pregnancy and your time to conceive, how long it takes to conceive, and your pregnancy outcomes and pregnancy complications, things like preeclampsia and all these different aspects that are sometimes being sperm caused by the sperm. And so recognizing that, yes, it's about the long-term health of the future children, but it's also about like how easily and successful your pregnancy is. And so that's an important component of this, because you really want to really smooth as possible process there.
Yeah. And just a note to the dudes listening. One thing that just stuck out to me a lot in this research that I've been doing and preparing for this was that a lot of these issues, it's probably half of, the equation is the sperm. So the idea that guys aren't having an impact in the fertility conversation, and if there's infertility or if there's complications and if there's miscarriages and there's these things, you're totally just as much of a contributing factor as women are in the equation. Do you agree with that, Josh?
I would agree. There's a little bit of conflict in the science literature where it says like 1/3 of all infertility cases are male factor and 1/3 are female and 1/3 are unexplained. But it's like if it's unexplained, it could go 50-50 either way. And so then other people interpret that data and say it's 50-50 in terms of infertility, causes of infertility. I think that's spot on. And in terms of like, it takes two. It's a 50-50 thing. So men, you're playing a huge role. There are certain things where paternal influence is actually more important. And that's, I think, where you're headed next, but it's in terms of the toxin exposure. And so toxin exposure can have a much larger impact actually on the male fertility. And that's kind of the crisis that we're in now.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about why we're calling it a crisis. And this is, to some people, might seem like it might be a bit of a red pill or a black pill or something. It's not a fun pill to swallow. Let's just say that. So basically, I'm just going to read a couple of things from just snippets from Shauna Swan's book, Countdown. And she's a PhD researcher who's been down in the weeds with studying fertility for decades. I would say would you agree she's kind of like a leader in the field?
Absolutely. Preeminent, over 30 years deep. She is, absolutely.
Yeah. So this is a book that's worth reading if you have the stomach for it, but you can also just kind of get the picture just with a couple of snippets. But today's sperm counts are roughly half what our grandfathers had, and projections indicate that by 2045, the median sperm count will reach 0. That's 0. That's
when my daughter turns 23.
Yeah. So if you have a son,
no more sperm.
If you have a son, he'll be potentially in an infertile generation, according to that projection.
Sure. Median is the important key there, because my son will definitely have some sperm left. I'll make sure of it.
It's not to say everyone will be at 0, but the fact that a huge percentage of people will have pretty much infertility is the
less than 0.
Yeah, is the assumption there. So another quote: the current rate of decline in sperm count, which is 1.25% per year, means that a significant number of men will have sperm counts low enough to impair fertility, and that's today. Like that's where we're at now. A lot of men have sperm counts that are problematic for fertility already. And men's testosterone levels are dropping at the same rate as their sperm counts, which suggests it's not just sperm production, but overall male endocrine function that's being disrupted, which is going to, be our segue into this conversation around environmental toxins and how it's, disrupting endocrine function as a whole, meaning your hormonal system. Testosterone being the key component of that for men. And then the final quote here is, the fertility crisis is an urgent but largely unrecognized population crisis. We are not reproducing ourselves. So she's extrapolating and implying here that we're actually, in some sense, an endangered species, and that we're, even though it seems like the opposite with the world kind of blooming up, 8 billion individuals and still on the rise because of continents like Africa that are still having a lot of children. But in the modern world, you're seeing the opposite trend, and you're seeing this downtrend and this declination in fertility and in reproduction, where the birth rate's not quite even replacing the death rate. And so basically, she's saying that given the trends and given the data, it looks like we might be in a serious crisis of, will our species even continue? So it's like an existential crisis in the frame of fertility. Does that track for you?
Absolutely. I consider it one of the existential crises for humanity. There's a lot to unpack in each of those quotes. Each one's kind of its own can of worms. I'm just going to touch briefly on it. You talked about sperm counts declining at 1.25%. I think that book was published in 2020. She since has released a study that came out in 2022, co-authored with a number of other scientists, but essentially that was a meta-analysis globally, and it actually upped the rate of sperm count decline, I think 2.4%, starting in 2000. And so that rate of decline is increasing since even the book was published. And as far as like the population challenge, there were many years as an ecologically minded environmentalist, so to speak, that I was terrified of a population explosion crisis, essentially. And yet what we're beginning to be faced with is like a aging population in most of the developed world that's going to put a real strain on our social services and our social structure, as there's a really declining smaller population of workforce to basically support this elderly population. And then there's a whole other aspect where through this whole process, we're actually getting less and less male men essentially are being born. And so initially the balance was about 105 boys to 100 girls, was kind of like the natural average. And we're seeing that rate completely shift. And so now it's looking like, in 30 years, the majority of the population is going to be like over 65 and female.
So just to that last point you made, I'm clear on it. So you're saying that it's not a 1-to-1 ratio naturally. If we were in our natural habitat, you had a hunter-gatherer society reproducing, it's not quite a 1-to-1 on males to females, and there's actually more females already. Is that correct?
As I understand, it's actually slightly more males per percentage. And what's happening is that's switching.
Got it.
Essentially, mostly through the endocrine system. So yeah, as you noted, the endocrine system is essentially the system that regulates hormones in our body. And so there's basically two primary axes through which those hormones are regulated. One is the HPA axis. So that's your hypothalamus, your pituitary, and your adrenals. So that's essentially the way that you regulate all of your stress hormones, cortisol and all of that. And then there's the HPG axis, which is the hypothalamus, pituitary, and gonads. So the gonads being your balls if you're a guy, your ovaries if you're a woman, essentially. And so the different cascades of hormones affect everything. And so many different things in our lifestyle can affect the way that those hormones cycle. And that's where the the endocrine disrupting chemicals come in. And that's a large portion of Shauna Swan's book, where she really runs through like, here's where all the chemicals coming from. And then she really breaks down like the effects they're having on society, the effects they're having on fertility, the effects they're having on gender, and the effects they're having on like even what I'm talking about now, like the differences in male to female ratios, in anal genital distance and fertility. She's showing a lot of different correlations between chemical exposure in the mother, and then infertility in the future son, and then it's pretty deep. We can dive into any of those that you want.
Yeah, each one is a dark place to go. None of it's rosy, but basically the overall picture. I mean, you can read the book. You can double click on any of those concepts, but the big picture is when you start to kind of get all the evidence stacking up, you start to realize, okay, so we covered the biology. We understand that our health has an impact on our offspring for sure, and fertility isn't just a binary yes no. It's very much a spectrum, and then our environment has a huge impact on our biology. So if our environment is upstream of our biology in some sense, like if you're in a toxic environment, that's going to have downstream effects on biology, which then has downstream effects on fertility and your offspring. So basically, the picture that I'm trying to paint here is that it's a crisis because it's a fertility crisis because we're already in a health crisis and an environmental crisis, right? So because we are, mass producing, well, I guess you would say it's ever since we started mining and pulling things up from the ground through the fossil fuel industry and through the mining industry and these kind of big industry domains where we're changing the natural environment in a way that our biological systems don't recognize and don't know what to do with it, right? Like we have evolved in a planet where everything that in the biosphere is more or less consistent. Like it's biology recycling itself, right? So it's the same sort of molecules that are going from sunlight and photosynthesis into plant life, into animal life, into fungi and back into the soil, and then kind of like recycling in this web of life. And then when you go in and you start clear cutting forests and pulling up copper and all these different metals and mercury and all these different things that you're pulling up out of the ground, or oil, and turning it into all of these different plastics and refining it into these different products. And then now the environment is completely just saturated with all of those molecules and compounds. And a lot of them are, because they're so almost antithetical to the biosphere, in the way that the biosphere has evolved. A lot of these are not only toxic, but they're even forever. She calls them forever chemicals, where nothing in nature knows what to do with it, and it's not water soluble, and it's got this ridiculously long half-life. So we're getting these like fire retardants that we're putting in our structures in the built space to stop fire, but then those are little particulates of that fire retardant are now getting into your body through breathing in dust in various different ways, and those chemicals are just going to live in your body now because there's no way for your body to do anything with them, right? And that's just one example. The phthalates and plastics are a little bit more water soluble, so those pass out of your body a lot faster in just about a day or so. But the problem with the phthalates is they're so ubiquitous that even if they pass through, you're constantly getting more put in. So you could test anyone at any given time and they're going to have phthalates in their system because it's coming in through their cosmetics, it's coming in through the plastics in the water bottle and the different containers that their food's stored in, and all these myriad things. Like when you start to peel back the veil here and they're like, holy fuck, everything in our modern environment is trying to kill your sperm.
Yeah, I mean,
your health.
You nailed it. The one thing I think I would contribute there is that you were talking about how kind of these man-made artificial chemicals and kind of extracted industry byproducts are really antithetical to the natural process. And the irony is that many of these chemicals then mimic hormones inside our body, and our body internalizes them as a hormone. And so, we call these something like a xenoestrogen, where BPA essentially acts as estrogen inside your body and binds to the estrogen receptors and screws up your entire hormonal balance because your body actually thinks there's a way more estrogen than there actually is. And so there's some irony there. It's like, yeah, these are completely unnatural chemicals, and yet the way that your body is trying to manage them is often like interpreting them as endogenous hormones. So
yeah, it's almost like nature has these balances, and it's almost like a sick joke that we're playing on ourselves in some sense, right? Like it's,
I mean, you could go down the rabbit hole. It's like a James Lovelock Gaia hypothesis
right,
coming back to right itself. But
right. Like that there's this sort of consciousness to it. And as we're kind of breaking the rules, so to speak, we're getting the immediate feedback from that. And it's, it's like, oh, do you want to continue is this going to be one of those species that just sort of like invents its way out of existence, right? And we sort of innovate our way to extinction. I don't know. It's just when there's a lot of ways we could go from here on like philosophical tangents, right? About like where humanity's headed and stuff like that. And that's how my mind works. And I tend to bend in that direction conversationally. Like I like to talk about that kind of stuff for some reason.
that's fine.
But
Yeah.
but what I'm also trying to do is I'm trying to make this a little bit more practical and tactical for people about who are like trying to conceive and who are trying to orient towards a more beautiful world, and not, create the dystopia of both the environmental collapse that we're kind of heading towards, but also the weird sort of artificial wombs and the robots taking care of grandma because there's no young people around, and all of that shit, right? Like that's also part of this equation. So let's quickly, I think, well, I don't know if it's quick or not, but I think this is part of the question too, outside of just how do I control my or optimize my environment, and what are my levers for controlling my fertility and my health. Instead of just focusing on that, there's also a bigger philosophical question, which is why procreate in the first place, right? Why have children? And I
Sure.
think that is
Yeah.
actually, that question is actually also a huge, obviously it's not in the data in the same way. Like it's not from a biological scientist, a biologist like Shauna Swan, she's not factoring that into her data. She's just looking at sperm counts and the kind of hard science, which is great. But I think there's another component here, which is just that in the same way that it's the irony of we, kind of destroy natural systems, and then the byproduct of our pollution is fucking up our ability to procreate. In the same way, when we kind of like lost the sacred, and there was the sort of death of the divine, or the you might say just the rise of this sort of secularism and whatever, that's also kind of left a meaning crisis and a kind of hole in our souls. And I think that also is contributing to this fertility issue. I mean, the fact that people don't even want to fucking have kids. They don't have any hope for the future. So
Right. The nihilism is rampant, especially in some of the younger generations. So
yeah. So
yeah,
why are
I
you?
feel
So
that.
why are you? I mean, you're a father, so give me some insight into.
Why'd I have
Yeah,
kids?
yeah. Give me
Yeah.
some insight.
How'd I sometimes think we were sitting around the campfire a few months ago, and my buddy looked at me and he said, like, how did you go from kid skeptic to, fertility coach? Like, can you drop in on that? And I keep thinking about it because there were a few years there where I was standing in my ecological righteousness, not another carbon footprint sort of mentality, and combined with a real like abject terror of bringing a child into a collapsing global ecosystem, where I was like, no way would I have a kid. Like the world's doomed, and like having a kid is just getting us there faster. So like, don't do that. So I spent a few years in that place. That's, kid skeptic. I wouldn't say completely adverse to kids, but not necessarily shooting for it. And yet I think there was a longer time earlier on in my life, childhood through adolescence and teenage years and stuff, where I just kind of always assumed that having a kid was a kind of essential part of the human experience. And so I kind of had those two competing views in my life. And then I found myself fully entrenched in kind of like the ecologically righteous, moral, I'm not going to have a kid sort of view. And what really brought me out of that was kind of threefold. One, I was listening to a podcast. I think we're both podcast fans. It was a Daniel Schmachtenberger, Brett Weinstein podcast. And they were riffing on who knows what. I honestly can't remember most of the podcast, but what I really remember them both agreeing on with a lot of passion was that the world's in a really screwed up place. There's a tremendous amount of problems, and that the solutions to the world's problems are not single generation solutions.
Yeah.
And I was hearing that news as someone who had been passionately studying and involved in regenerative design, ecological design, myco and biofiltration, and all these kind of like ecological technologies for repairing the earth, and was like super passionate about that stuff. And so it's like suddenly like, oh wow, like I'm not going to solve this problem in my lifetime. And as soon as you start to like conceive that the world is bigger than your lifetime, I think then you start to conceive like, how do I then bring in future generations that also embody my ethos and hopefully can share in my desire to like fix the problems of our ancestors or even our fathers or even our problems. And so that was a big switch point for me somehow in the distillation and integration of that kind of realization. Another thing, one of my friends, similar time frame in my life, I was probably young 30s. One of my friends was reading Sand Talk. I'm not exactly sure when that book came out, but it's about how indigenous wisdom can really help kind of like us get a better understanding of ourselves and the world and implement strategies. And that's really about some of the Aboriginal origin myths as he was telling it to me. This is all kind of secondhand that I remember him telling me. It's like so much that the humans in so many of these Aboriginal origin myths were the shepherd, were the steward, were the entity within the ecosystem that really orchestrated and catalyzed the positive, brought all the different species together for the benefit of all. And I think we've really lost that place as a species. But I think it's kind of like the highest ideal for humanity to really step into that. We have so many more capabilities than most of the other species, at least that we're willing to acknowledge. And so to really try to shepherd humanity in the direction of stepping in as global custodians is beautiful to me. And so and then of course the third component is just like my relationship with my wife and my love for her and her real desire to have a family. And yeah, here I am. I have a kid and I'm super happy about it.
Yeah, I mean, congratulations, man. It's beautiful that you've made that leap, taken that leap, and I think it seems to me like an unfolding of the evolution of consciousness, and a maturation process as well, is what it seems like, because it's going from more of an egocentric perspective of the world, and the world is sort of for you in some sense, right?
Yep.
And you're kind of at the center of it, to then kind of getting outside of yourself a little bit more and seeing a bigger picture and seeing something beyond yourself. And maybe like, instead of being in service of me, it's being in service of the we, and potentially even in service of thee, or something just greater. Yeah. And so I would say that I'm weirdly turning 30 had a weird sort of impact on me. Just it's interesting. Like when I turned 30, the night I turned 30, me and my partner broke up and we were in like a long-term, serious relationship. And it was this weird sort of, it was like the last sort of attempt at to keep the grasp on my sort of freedom and my young sort of egotistical self, and I think it was honestly an important part of that maturation process, because when we did separate, it gave both of us space to evolve and grow on our own, and we kind of needed that time apart. But part of that time apart, a huge part of that was actually me coming to the realization that this is really what this is just a competing commitment. And it's me actually sabotaging what I truly want and trying to hang on to some sort of weird ideal, right? That is really not even, like, in other words, the idea that you're just going to like be this, I don't know, so like bachelor or some sort of like maximally free dude who's just always exploring and all that kind of stuff. It's like, is that really what I want? Because if you think about it in terms of polarity, right? And it's not just, it's, there's this saying from the Kybalion, which is that all truths are but half truths, and that everything is polarity. So if you think about it in terms of like, okay, what's the other polarity here besides just the freedom, right? Because nobody wants just freedom. If you had endless freedom and you were always traveling and leaving and moving, and you didn't have that deeper connection and commitment, then there's a lack in some sense, right? So there's a balance that you're trying to strike between wanting to have my sovereignty and individual freedom and creativity and like my ability to be myself. And then also the other side of that equation to me is the depth of intimacy and belonging and connection and meaning and like, like service, like giving myself to something meaningful. And it was this, a lot of it had to do with training with FGP. I know you're familiar with Jamie and FGP, but Jamie Will, that is. But basically, I ended up kind of unearthing this kind of competing commitment, and that was a big tipping point for me. But I like to echo sort of what you said. I think that if we really want to, I personally, maybe I'm an idealist, but I think that there's no bounds to human creativity, and there's really no upside. I mean, sorry, there's no upper limit is what I mean. There's no upper limit to what human beings are capable of. And really what it is we're just sort of in my view, we're kind of like the cosmic erotic creative force that's just manifesting in the most, in my opinion, interesting species yet. Like the capacity to really just like create anything, like at this, almost at the snap of a finger. I mean, at the rate of exponential change right now and technological innovation and all these different things, we're like cracking and decoding other species' language, and we're with AI, and we're like going to space, and we're sequencing genomes, and we're doing all this crazy shit. And it's just the beginning if we get through the filter, And I think that the big filter here seems to be human coordination. So our failure to, and it makes a lot of sense. We evolved in small tribes. We evolved at this very local level in a Dunbar level society where you could kind of know everybody that like there's no just acquaintances. It's like there's relational value between humans in your tribe, and that's the only way to make it work. And as soon as it gets beyond that level where your neocortex can kind of simulate the thinking of everyone else and you can kind of know everyone, then the tribe fractures into multiple groups so that everyone can know everyone. So we've always had that operating system until we got to agriculture, civilization, these sort of abstractions that have created an institutions that can scaffold and create larger societies and larger groups. But when we made that shift, we never really got into a super positive operating system that, on the one hand creates really, really coherent group coordination, and on the other hand, still maintains the sovereignty and creativity of the individual. So I see where we're at right now as the project, one of the main projects being, how do we figure out how to be a global species that can coordinate and steward the planet? Because when you look at the map, you see all these lines and nation states and bullshit. When you look at Earth from space, you just see Gaia, you just see the jewel, you just see, the beautiful, home that is the home of every human who's ever existed, right? And I love Carl Sagan's bit about the pale blue dot, and every human that ever was or has existed on that mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. So it really, from that perspective, you're like, okay, we're all one. The oceans are all connected. The biosphere is all connected. The noosphere is now all connected. Like our minds, in other words, are being connected through things like this and the internet. So really, at some level, I feel like we're trying to evolve and emerge to be the stewards, to be the species that can coordinate on this grandiose scale and creating kind of this super organism, right?
I hope so. Yeah, I hope so.
And so in that frame, though, if we're trying to imagine, and this was all to say, this is all just a preface to say, I don't think there's any limit to our capacity. Really, it's just a function of our imagination. And so whatever I would say that our collective whatever we can imagine collectively is what we're creating and manifesting collectively. So our reality, the reality of our planet on Earth, is sort of a byproduct of the collective human imagination in some sense. And nihilism and despair, to quote Wade Davis, despair is a lack of imagination. It's just a fucking lack of imagination. It's saying, I can imagine a better future, so I'm not going to have kids, you know?
Yep.
And I get it, you know, like I've been in the same hole. So I like you have, you know, I totally get it. So I empathize with people, but I'm stoked to be in a pretty, I would say, fertile imaginatory space right now. And I'm super stoked about what's possible and the more beautiful world that we can create. And I think that in and of itself is part of the fertility equation in some sense. Like you really, in order to have the desire to even want to go there and to have this conversation with you and be learning about fertility and be preparing for it, I had to have a kind of consciousness shift in the way of really going all in on the future and all in on my life right now and fully sending it. And I think that it's not going to be for everyone. You can still fully send it on your life and not have children, but I do think for a lot of people that's, you know, kind of the calling. So yeah, I think that I don't know. There's a bit of a pep talk here, but I'm curious about how we can shift consciousness, because I see that as sort of the base layer. Obviously, we can clean up our environment. Obviously, we can change our lifestyle. Obviously, we can improve our health. And, you know, you're an example of helping someone who can help people do that. But if there's no desire, if there's no will, if there's no imagination, if you're not actually open to that reality emerging, it's never going to fucking happen for you. So I think that that's kind of one of the ingredients that you don't really hear about when you're listening to the biologists talk about it, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, she talks a little bit about like in different cultures, especially in like Japan and stuff, where you know, people are just not into sex as much and they stay at home and watch TV, and there's like a complete divergence in like a desire to procreate. So but yeah, it's very much in a scientific point of view. It's not really embodying the heart of it. I appreciate your talk about kind of the earth as a single symbol, because I have a giant earth flag here on my wall behind my computer that you can't see, but I look at it every day, and it's just that, a picture of the earth from space. So super powerful. I appreciate that symbolism immensely. And then as far as just like how we change that consciousness shift, whether it's for fertility or any number of other things, to like radically implement the new world we believe is possible. I mean, in my mind, it really starts with like comprehensive, radically awesome education. And so it's just like, I've been thinking a lot about that now that I have a daughter, and just like how the words I use and actions I have. And, you know, we've been down this new rabbit hole, my wife and I, with this new book we're reading called The Nurture Revolution, about the way brains form. And, you know, the potential to shift consciousness in our own selves through diet and lifestyle and meditation and substances is also obviously paramount, but the ability to do that from the point of conception or preconception, and really like, you know, there's another great book I'd recommend to your listeners who are considering having kids, and to you as well. It's called Real Food for Pregnancy by Lily Nichols. And I think she's actually about to release a preconception book as well. But it's just like the science, hard-hitting science of nutrition for prenatal and postpartum and pregnancy. And it's awesome book. So yeah, real food for pregnancy. But in that book, she really talks about kind of like the different nutrients and the effects it has on brain growth. And so like, I definitely tend to go science-based, but the consciousness aspect is so much like that nature nurture. It's like, are you providing the nutrients to like evolve humans? Like I've thought for many, many years, decades now, I feel like, of like what's the next step in the human evolution? My friend Hayden used to joke, he'd say, oh, the next step is super sapien. You know, it's just like kind of like the evolution of Homo sapien. But you know, where do we go next, and how do we get there, and how do we as humans shepherd in that new future? You know, I've staked my flag, at least for the next bit of my life, in the preconception health, because I think it has a potential to have enormous ripple. You know, I think healthy people have more time and more energy to apply themselves to X, Y, and Z, and just be more present and active and engaged with all of the potential creative tasks that we have ahead of us. And that like there's so much drag on the social and economic and political system just through like declining health. And so like I was staking my flag in preconception health because I really believe that like that has the widest ripple effect for implications of like where humanity goes. But yeah, man, it's like it's a can of worms. There's so many different ways we could
Yeah,
go.
it is. And I'm stoked that you've staked your flag there. It is super important, and it's one of those things that I was not even on my radar even a little bit, a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
So it is very interesting how much, I mean, how life really is a journey, and you go through these different kind of stages or chapters. And yeah, I find myself in a stage right now where I'm really thinking a lot about how to be a good ancestor. And I think that sums it up pretty well. Like preconception health is being a good ancestor. It's part of the equation, and it's obviously part of it. Like it's not the whole story, because you got to be a good ancestor while that baby's in utero, and then while you're raising them. You talked about that. What was that book called? You said about brain development.
That other book that book's incredible. It's a new release. I think it came out this summer. My disclaimer there is that I have not read the whole thing because my wife's reading it, so I'm reading it in between when I can sneak it away. But it's called The Nurture Revolution. It's by Greer Krishnenbaum, and it's the premise essentially there. She's a PhD neuroscientist and mother, and the whole premise in that book is essentially that the greatest time of neuroplasticity is age 0 to 3. And essentially from age 0 to 3, your brain is developing, I'm getting the number wrong, but essentially it's like 100 million synaptic connections every 10 seconds. And so that development of synaptic connections essentially creates a hyper dense neural network into the brain up until age 3. And the more exposure that your child can have to a diverse array of experiences helps really create a hyper dense network. And this network of neural connections also affects the way that the different cortexes of the brain physically form. So it affects the shape of the cortex formation. And essentially at age 3, that neuroplasticity tapers off. And from age 3 on, you get a pruning effect where the hyperdense structure of the brain is pruned back, and the neural connections and synapses that are utilized and actively exercised essentially are the ones that kind of solidify into the brain. And then essentially, there's only 2 other large periods of time in your life, or short periods of time rather, but 2 other major periods of time in your life when you have other areas of neuroplasticity, and that's puberty, and then that's also when you become a parent. So patriescence and matrescence. So the act of becoming a parent also re-stimulates neuroplasticity in the brain in the way that you engage with your child. And she really posits it as the way to instill long-lasting mental health for the children, because it's called the Nurture Revolution, because she really promotes a nurture framework for parenting, which is antithetical to pretty much all of mainstream Western parenting models. So, be aware it's a little bit against the grain. I fully endorse it, but essentially it's doing the emotional and cognitive regulation, essentially like the nervous system regulation for the young children who are unable to do that on their own. And in doing so, generating neurocascades of neurotransmitters, primarily oxytocin and serotonin based, that allow the brain to get washed in these really beneficial neurotransmitters. And in doing so, you really change the shape of the neural structure and formation in a way that really generates longer, more resilience in terms of mental health. And so it's a physical change that has a really long lasting psychological change. And it's profound and super powerful. And it's the first 3 years of your child's life. And it's like, and like people say like, oh, they don't even remember the first 3 years. Like, doesn't matter. And her whole point is like, it's the memory they can't access, but it's like the deepest, most ingrained, important level. There's all this like studies are like, if your child can hears Vietnamese essentially before the age of 3, and they never hear it again essentially, but they hear enough of it before the age of 3, when they're whatever 20 or 30, they'll be able to recreate the native intonation in the language. But if they don't hear the language before the age of 3, even if they learned it at a later stage in life, they'll never be able to properly mimic the intonations of the native language. And so just like really cool, like neuroscience, and like I've been geeking on that especially. And then like how much of that is epigenetic, and like how does that transfer through, and how can we instill, and like feeding my daughter like lots. She loves wild salmon, so she just gets like tons of omega-3s to build her brain, and DHA and EPA, and just like trying to make it all happen.
Yeah, man,
Yeah, I geek out on that
It's
stuff. Yeah,
rad. I can tell you're
yeah,
passionate about it. There's a whole another chapter ahead of me that I haven't hit yet because I haven't had that revolution of becoming a father yet, which I know based
yeah.
on literally 100% of the fathers that I know that have all told me that it's like not only totally life changing, but also one of the best things, if not the best thing they've ever done with their life. So it's like I can tell it's a huge, paradigm shifting, and obviously from a neuroscience perspective, there's apparently a lot of neuroplasticity happening there, which makes sense to me. Two questions about what you just were talking about. One is on neuroplasticity because I feel like, yeah, there's these three phases where I guess they're catalyst kind of high impact zones of your life for neuroplasticity,
Yeah.
but I know that there's been a lot more data coming out in the last decade or so about neuroplasticity, and that we kind of have shifting the paradigm from this idea that once you become an adult, your brain's developed and there's no way to really change your brain,
Sure.
to understanding that there's actually still adult development and neuroplasticity that can occur, later on in your life. I mean, how else do you learn things, right? As an adult, learn a new skill, or even a language. Of course, it's
Totally.
harder. It's harder to learn a language than a child would, pick it up a lot faster, but it's still there. I'm a big fan of getting into the growth mindset and into the frame that um, you can evolve, you can change. And if I just look at who I am now versus who I was at 25, barely even know that guy. And that was just 6 years ago. So yeah,
Yeah.
neuroplasticity is something that I would admonish that anybody can, at any phase in life, you can focus on optimizing that and learning and always be a lifelong learner, right? Uh,
I absolutely agree with that. And I don't mean to say that neuroplasticity doesn't exist in the other periods of life. And again, my caveat on that book is that I haven't finished it. I'm only a little bit into it. Um, but that's what I was able to distill from what I was able to digest so far. As far as like the ability for adults to encourage neuroplasticity, we all know a few different ways to do that. But these are kind of like the main naturally
yeah,
occurring without an external optimized lifestyle or attempts to really do it. This is like what
yeah,
occurs naturally in the
yeah. It's
brain
just
chemistry.
a function of nature being nature, which is really cool. It's kind of crazy that that happens as a parent. I mean, it makes a lot of sense, but it's I never really thought about it that way. And my other question is like about what you were saying, this idea of did you call it the nurture effect or something, where basically if a child, you said helping them neuroregulate. So can you unpack that for me a little bit? Like, why is that a controversial idea?
There seems to be, from my awareness, a tendency in mainstream Western child rearing practice habit, a tendency towards um, individuality, self-soothing, like the ability to generate, basically become autonomous as fast as possible. And I think this has motivations rooted in a couple of different arenas. One being like the autonomy of the American dream and like, come on, get yourself up and like you're ready to go at age 6 months sort of thing. And the other being that like we got to get the moms and dads back in the office and the workforce, and like we need them sleeping all night long, and we can't afford to have any groggy parents back on the workforce. So like, let's really instill a child rearing style that promotes no co-sleeping, sleeping in the other room, cry it out, essentially is like sleep training. And so this book is essentially saying that if you allow your baby to cry it out consistently, they essentially reach a state where they aren't able to regulate themselves, and then they just go numb after a period of like constantly heightened emotion, basically cortisol release, stress release that's unable to be soothed. Then um, that repeatedly happening over and
Mm,
over and over changes the way that their brain forms because they're not getting that nurture. And so it's not like you're going to be a perfect parent. Your kid's going to fall down and smack their head and hurt themselves, and you're going to like they're going to cry and you're not going to hear them, and they're going to cry for 5 minutes or however long, and you're going to get them. And like, you're never going to be perfect, but it's the way that you continually show soothing and nurture to your child that allows them to then regulate through you, so that their nervous system essentially regulates through the way that you respond and engage with them.
interesting. Yeah. So it's almost
Yeah.
seems almost kind of counterintuitive, but by giving them the support and nurturing that they need, they can then actually form a more secure type of attachment and be still autonomous, but more, I guess, switched on and regulated as a self, as an individual, right? Instead of being completely destabilized and numbed out.
Very similar to attachment parenting, which is another kind of like labeled style of parenting. But essentially, attachment parenting, I think, basically says like there is some studies to suggest that attachment parenting tends to lead to more independent and autonomous adults, and that by giving children the ability to feel fully like supported and nurtured, that they then are later able to blossom into the independence. And you say it kind of like maybe goes against your intuition, but I think as soon as you become a parent, it will be like your intuition. And to me, it really feels just like intuitive parenting. Like if your baby is screaming their head off in the other room and you're consciously choosing to ignore them, to me, that is like a complete discord with my intuitive sense that like there's something wrong and I should go engage with them. And it's to each their own. I don't mean to have judgment about other people. Each person gets to choose their own path. For me, the science of this book really helps me stay validated in my intuitive parenting and say like, okay, the choice that I'm consciously choosing to make from an intuitive level is backed in science and really does support long-term mental health. So I appreciate the science behind it.
Yeah. And on some level, like the decriminalization of intuition, or at least, acknowledging that it's real and that it's grounded in some sort of probably evolutionary process and deep time, of our species reproducing and figuring out how to make that work. So yeah, it's an interesting thing. I'm sure that's a future rabbit hole for me, child development. I'm sure that'll be a huge chapter of just learning and studying and whatnot, and trying to increase my own neuroplasticity about it. But so let's dive in a little bit about just the things people can do. And specifically, we're going to speak to men and to male fertility, because that's your expertise. It's also my need at the moment, so it's kind of perfect. This is a cool little, I think, sounding board for people who might get like a little window into what you're doing for people, how you're helping guys in this process, right? So you've
totally. I wonder if we may have dove into the hard science a bit quick at the beginning, so people are like, "Whoa, what's going on? This is like hard science going over my head." So I hope they're still here to listen to this, because this is kind of like the juice. But essentially,
well, I was going to say, and I'll put a little caveat in the intro so that people know it's not just a bunch of science jargon, but it is important to understand that it's like this is all grounded in real biology, and that it's not, there's nothing unscientific or this very practical approach, I would say. And based on what I took from just studying with Huberman Lab and stuff, and also Shauna Swan's book as well, it seems like the kind of main categories of focus would be optimizing lifestyle, optimizing your environment, aka reducing exposure to toxins. There's nutritional kind of diet and supplementation, utilizing professionals with medical checkups, things like sperm testing and things like that. And then just having like a good, and this is part of lifestyle, exercise, mind-body techniques, just the ability to really reduce stress is a big part of it, because stress seems to be one of the major sperm killers, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Cortisol is considered your stress hormone, has a huge effect on sperm. So yeah, I really resonate with all of those. I've I guess taken most of those and distilled them into my methodology, if not all of them. So I developed a methodology to really try to present this information in a comprehensive way that's easily understood and relatively easy to remember. And so I have a SPERM methodology. So it's a SPERM framework. It's an acronym. It stands for sustenance. So this is the nutrition and supplementation and hydration. It stands for purity. This is the P. So the purity is really my environmental component. So it's not like chastity purity, but rather like your exposure to environmental toxins and improving your ability to detox.
You actually need the opposite of chastity to get pregnant.
Yeah, of course. And E is exercise. This is also kind of like the whole physiology body module. So this is everything related to posture and temperature and exercise and different types of exercise. And R is rest. Sleep is a critical component of hormone cycling and fertility and general health. And then M is mindset. And so this is both how you get the motivation to implement all of these other changes and how you really regulate your stress response. And so obviously short-term stress is sometimes beneficial. It's what stimulates the fight or flight. We naturally develop this and evolve to have some sort of short-term stress, but it's the chronic levels of stress that are really detrimental to long-term or even short-term fertility health. And so using that framework, the sperm framework, it's essentially, I think of it as 5 columns essentially. In the previous life, I was way involved in audio. So I sometimes think of it as audio faders on like a mixing board, essentially. And the higher you can get all 5 of those, like the better you're doing overall. And if you really are like, where do I fine tune? You could pick one at a time if you want. And you just try to adjust the volume up on that one and just like really push that column up. And so within that framework, there's also kind of like 4 other major areas that cross over those 5 pillars. And those are hormone balancing. So that's an essential component of fertility. It's reducing inflammation. So this is reducing systemic chronic inflammation, reducing oxidative stress. So oxidative stress is essential internally rusting, essentially is the way you can think about it. But it's essentially when a reactive oxygen species that's unstable kind of wreaks cellular or genetic damage inside your body. You're always generating a little bit of oxidative stress, but you really want to have a balance there. And then the 4th is DNA methylation. And so that's really how we're trying to optimize the epigenetics. And so all 5 of those columns, all 5 of the sperm modules will influence those 4 kind of overarching health parameters.
Gotcha. Hormones, oxidative stress, methylation. What was the other one? The second one?
Inflammation.
That's right. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're up for it,
sure.
Let's kind of break this sperm acronym down, which by the way, kudos for developing this methodology, because this is such a dense for a lot of people. If you don't have a biology background, and even if you do, it's, there's just so much going into this and there's so much information. So I think simplifying it in a way that people can actually understand and then remember is the name of the game. And I think you've done a great job of that, at least with the sperm acronym. That's an awesome start. There's still a lot of nuance to each one, it seems like. So let's talk about sustenance. So obviously food, nutrition, like as if, I'm a client or whatever, what would you advise on nutrition? So I'm already, cutting out most processed foods, or trying to at least, and like I'm at least cutting out like sugar and most of the bullshit, right? So and I do some intermittent fasting. So I'm in pretty relatively healthy on the level of BMI and that kind of stuff. But what other words do you have to offer about nutrition?
Do you track your blood sugar?
No.
Have you? No. So that would be a great place to start. And you could start just with like a standard test. You could get your HbA1c test done. You could just get your fasting glucose level done. This was a big illuminator for me in terms of, I thought I was eating super healthy. I was eating almost exclusively organic, if not 100% organic. And I would cook 3 meals a day in my own home. And so I thought I was like really optimizing my nutrition health profile. And in reality, I was like hyper overloading on carbs, and I was getting excessive blood sugar spikes. And so blood sugar is a massive component in oxidative stress and in inflammation and in hormone regulation. And so really working to optimize your blood sugar is something I would really strongly recommend. That's a huge component of the nutrition aspect.
Okay.
So HbA1c, just to give you a little bit of reference on that, that's essentially a 3-month average of your glucose level, of your blood glucose level. And essentially, there's 3 main macronutrients: fats, carbs, and proteins. And so carbohydrates convert to glucose inside your body. And so carbohydrates are generally the primary form of blood sugar that will spike your blood sugar. Fats and proteins, not so much. And so that's a big place to start, is balancing your blood sugar. And then really working to remove inflammatory foods and foods that are causing oxidative stress, and really working to bring in nutrient dense foods. So these are the foods that have the most nutrient density. Your body doesn't have to work as hard to get the nutrients, and they just kind of like pack the most punch. So some of the most nutrient dense foods on the planet are essentially animal organ meats. It's primarily liver. So like beef liver, chicken liver. Definitely want to caveat all of this with promoting pasture raised and grass fed meat. I am a proponent of eating meat. I was a vegan for a number of years, vegetarian for many years after that. And I've been eating meat probably 4 or 5 years now again. I was raised kind of omnivore. And just through the nutritional science and understanding, the bioavailability of animal proteins is much higher. But the caveat being that you really want to eat pasture raised and grass fed because it changes the omega-3, omega-6 ratio. So these are polyunsaturated fats. And polyunsaturated fats can have a tendency to be pro-inflammatory. The omega-6s are more inflammatory. Omega-3s are anti-inflammatory. And so there's a whole component here of really you want to add in as many beneficial foods as you possibly can. And then once you're kind of like stabilized and brought yourself up to a reasonable level of health, you can then start to like pull a bunch of stuff out.
What do you mean by pull a bunch of stuff out? Like what?
Just like you want to bring in the really good foods so that you're fully nurtured and you have enough nutrients before you just like cut out everything. You know what I mean? You don't want to like cut out all the bad foods and then be like, okay, what do I eat now? It's like, short of an elimination diet. Elimination diet is essentially where you cut out everything and then you introduce things back one at a time to see what's aggravating you. Those can be challenging to kind of ascertain what's going on because it can often be that a food sensitivity doesn't turn up for days, a number of days later. So you can like reintroduce something like eggs. You feel totally fine. And then 4 or 5 days later, you have a symptom and you don't draw it back to the eggs or something. And so I'm not a strong proponent of elimination diets, but I am a proponent of really bringing in a really nutrient dense, clean, whole food diet, and then really working to moderate blood sugar, reduce excessive refined carbs, and not promoting keto. I do think that complex carbs have a place, especially in fertility, especially for women as well. But you really want to be eliminating all your refined carbs because these carbs are going to convert to glucose in your bloodstream at a much faster rate.
And so essentially you're saying that cut all carbs out, but refined carbohydrates, things like sugars and just like you're going to find refined carbs in processed foods primarily, right? Yeah.
Processed foods. Yeah, but also bread, pasta, you know what I mean? White rice is kind of like borderline refined, but it's like the glycemic index on white rice is like 61, I think. It's like it's going to convert to glucose real fast. And so I promote a whole food, plant-centric diet with really clean animal protein sources. It's essentially, and a variety of healthy fats, focusing primarily on monounsaturated fats. Monounsaturated fats, just for your listeners, those are non-seed oil fats. So those are things like avocado oil, olive oil, and macadamia nut oil. And then certain omega-3s, which would be a polyunsaturated fat from fish, cold water fish.
What about
essentially is the best source.
Is it dairy that's primarily saturated fat, like grass-fed butter and whatnot?
Dairy does have a lot of saturated fat. It's also, dairy's kind of a contentious point. People love to plant their flag on one side of the divide or the other. What I learned through the oncology nutrition and really diving into the nutrigenomics is essentially eating for your gene type. It's not eating for your blood type, but it's a practice that's eating for your specific SNP. So a SNP is a segment of your gene profile called the single nucleotide polymorphism. Anyway, it's essentially the way that your ancestors' genes evolved to be able to digest certain enzymes or proteins or fats. And so certain populations can digest lactose, certain populations cannot digest lactose. And so there's like, you can't do like an all-encompassing like gluten's bad for everyone or dairy's bad for everyone or dairy's good for everyone. But dairy can be inflammatory for many people. And so I tend to not recommend dairy. You'll find that Lily Nichols in that Real Food for Pregnancy does cite some studies that show, a organic full fat dairy has had beneficial outcomes in pregnancy for pregnant women. So, the science is a little mixed on dairy. The caveat being that Dairy is often, unless you're getting like the prime dairy, is often enhanced with hormones, which can also affect your endocrine system. And dairy is also often high in sugars, so dairy can affect your blood glucose balance.
I think that the source is super key in anything, right? Like you want to make sure you're getting a high quality, but dairy.
Be careful on that sugar though too. Regardless of source, the dairy is going to have decent amount of sugar.
Yeah, unless you're specifically getting something like grass-fed butter or one of these kind of like higher fat dairy products, right? Like they're like as far as I'm aware, butter is really low in sugar. And you're basically, if you're drinking milk, you're probably getting quite a bit, right? So there's kind of there's definitely a nuanced conversation around dairy, which we don't have to dive into, but I do like grass-fed butter in my coffee, and I've been doing that for 10 plus years, and it's I find to be both awesome just for cognitive energy, but also a good sustained kind of almost meal for breakfast. I'll usually do a combination of grass-fed butter, some sort of nut butter, like high in fat, like almond butter, organic, obviously, if you can get it. And, some other things like collagen protein, and you have adaptogens listed here on your sustenance section under this acronym as well. So, some functional mushrooms and whatnot, but what do you recommend in the way of supplementation and adaptogens?
So just caveat back on the butter, I would just for your personal self, I would just be aware of your saturated fat intake. Higher saturated fat intakes are generally correlated with lower sperm parameters in men. So you want a less saturated fat intake would be, or limited saturated fat would be better for male fertility.
Okay, so we can linger on that for 1 second. So what would be too much? Like, in other words, what would you recommend removing or reducing from your diet besides, like, so if I'm having grass-fed butter in the morning in my coffee, which is like, say a tablespoon between 2 cups of coffee and I'm only having one of them, right? So it's half a tablespoon of butter or whatever it is. But my question is, like, you just reduce as much unsaturated fat as possible if you're trying to.
Well, you're going to be getting saturated fat through your meat sources as well, and so you got to dial that in. There's some software like Chronometer where you can dial in the exact. You can just say, like, I ate a 6-ounce boneless skinless chicken breast, or I ate a 6-ounce chicken breast with bone and skin, and it will show you like the saturated fat breakdown, so you can get like a real clear, like, okay, this is what I'm doing. And that's a good way for people to just, like, they want to get a better understanding of how much of a specific type of fat or nutrient that they're getting. It's just like dialogue, like do a diet journal on Chronometer. It's a free service, I believe. I used it for free some years ago. And you just like write down everything you ate every day, and you plug it in, and it will show you like how much fat you're eating, what type of fat you're eating, how many calories you're eating, how many grams of carbs you're eating every day. And that can give you, like, you can be a big wake up call, as well as the, testing your blood sugar after eating can really be a big wake up call. As far as the butter, like tablespoon to saturated fat conversion, I don't know exactly. I do know that when I ran the nutrigenomic profiles on myself, I personally have a SNP that if I eat over 20 grams of saturated fat, it can have detrimental effects on my blood sugar level, and I can actually convert to a higher blood sugar level, which sounds counterintuitive. But so yeah, just something to be aware of.
Yeah, because I know that like you said, you don't promote keto, but that's like doing the low carb, high fat thing is another way that a lot of people have, reduced their blood sugar. And even as far as I know, in some cases, people with like have diabetes or like pre-diabetes have been able to kind of counteract some of those effects with a low carb, high fat diet, right?
I think a low carb, high fat diet is very advantageous for many health challenges. It's what I was trained in is essentially therapeutic carb reduction. It's essentially a therapeutic form of keto that's not kind of like popular Hollywood keto for oncology for cancer patients. So I think there's a tremendous amount of health benefit to a high fat, low carb diet, but I don't take it to the extreme for fertility. And there's a number of different reasons. One is just like a lot of this is the ability to integrate the information and apply it into your life. But I also Complex carbs can be beneficial, I believe, especially for things like sleep and hormone regulation, especially if they're eaten later in the day. So by complex carbs, I mean whole food carbs that are not fruits, essentially. So these are things like spaghetti squash and, like
legumes and
beets
stuff,
and
right?
things like that. I actually don't promote a lot of legumes just because legumes, the lectins can be challenging to digest. Legumes do contain some protein. If you're a fully vegetarian and you don't want to eat meat and you're trying to increase your protein, legumes are going to be the best way for you to do that, I would say. But for like a really therapeutic 3 to 6 month preconception preparation diet, I would not advocate strongly for legumes. I would instead advocate for whole food vegetables and clean animal proteins.
I'm just taking some
Yeah,
notes because
that's
I'm
fine.
going to be tweaking my diet for sure. Like there's some changes to my diet that I think I'll need to make. I don't know if I'll cut the grass-fed butter out because I think it's coming from a good source, and I'm not taking in. I mean, as far as saturated fat goes, I guess that's just going to be animal products, right? Primarily, like animal protein and grass-fed butter and stuff.
Coconut oil, high in saturated
Right.
fat.
So I'm getting. What'd you say is like a good macro sort of ratio between protein, fat, and or different types of fats, and then carbs?
Sure. I mean, you can look at it as like a percentage of calorie intake, or you can look at it as a percentage of like what your plate looks like. It's kind of two different things. It's misleading because the calories and fat, it's so calorie rich that like it's a small portion of your diet visually, but it's a tremendously high portion of your diet calorically, if that makes sense. But you're looking at somewhere in like the like 30 to 40% carbs, 30% protein, and 40%, I guess like 40% fats and 30 somewhere in there. I can dial in exactly what that would look like, but it kind of depends on your body type and your BMI and things like that.
That's from a calorie perspective. So right.
That's a calorie perspective.
Mostly, or not mostly, but about 40% fat, 30% complex carbs, 30% protein, something along or somewhere close to that.
Yeah, I mean, visually, I'd strongly promote that a large portion of your plate is dark leafy greens,
which is going to be the carbs.
More,
it's going to be the carbs portion, but it's going to be
they're
going to
be
calories.
Carbs, but they're not. They are carbs, but they're not a ton of calories. But they're going to give you a ton of nutrients. A lot of vitamins and minerals in dark leafy greens, and a lot of the polyphenols, which are important for DNA methylation, will come out of the dark leafy greens.
Do you go primarily salads, or do you have all kinds of different ways of preparing?
I personally go both ways. I have some personal health issues that I've been dealing with on the digestive end that I've been dealing with for a number of years after a pretty grave illness coming out of the tropics. And so I've had certain kind of Chinese medicine doctors and stuff recommend that I minimize my complete raw vegetable intake and instead focus slightly more on cooked foods. But I love salads, and we have a big garden, and so I do eat salads, but I try to incorporate cooked foods into the salads per those recommendations. So I'll add in, a little bit of cooked vegetables into the salad. But yeah, I do salads. We grow a lot of kale and chard and do a lot of steamed stuff like that. Bok choy
would be a kind of another steamed vegetable you could do, or something like that. Okay, cool.
Yeah. But like dark leafy greens, like the really dark leafy greens are the good ones. So like chard, spinach, beet greens are great. Yeah, beets are also hugely important for the betaine. So they're like one of the best sources of betaine, which, just to rewind back to the beginning of the podcast, is one of those 4 important methyl donors. So betaine is one of those 4 critical nutrients that's going to really churn on your DNA methylation cycle.
So and all this is to say, we didn't go too much into this, but we're talking about what's good and nutrients to put in, but obviously, most of what you find in a grocery store and most of what you find at a restaurant or like fast food, most of that shit's just off the menu, right? In the way of trying to improve fertility. So
if you really want to dial it in, it pretty much means not eating out. Because the reality is the majority of oils used in any sort of restaurant establishment are none. I mean, if you can find a restaurant that's using high quality non-seed oils, show me the way. I'd love to try it out. But seed oils in general are pro-inflammatory because of the way that they're processed. So this is any sort of sunflower, safflower, canola, You want to cut all that stuff out of your diet. And if you're eating out, you generally consuming a decent amount of that stuff. So you're getting caloric intake from inflammatory, pro-inflammatory, polyunsaturated
Got
fat
it.
oils.
Yeah. So yeah, it's the bummer when it's like everything. It's not just the seed oils, man. It's like it's the way
Oh
that
yeah, of
the
course.
food's being prepared, and we didn't talk about, we haven't really talked about toxins in your environment much, but how you're preparing your food, what kind of pan it's being cooked on, if that's a nonstick.
Oh yeah, well that's the next module.
Yeah,
Purity.
we'll
We're
get there in a
getting
second. Okay,
there.
so just real quick to finish up
Yeah,
sustenance,
yeah.
adaptogens and supplements.
Adaptogens
Yeah,
and supplements. Yep. So, there's a list of supplements. Huberman drills down in that 4 hour
yeah.
podcast where he's like myoinositol and Shilajit, and he goes to the ends of the earth to find all the best fertility
I
supplements.
have a
So,
list of them right here,
I won't.
actually.
Yeah, I won't discredit those. I think some of those could be great. I have personally not used all of those supplements, so I can't speak totally to like how they made me feel or anything like that. I think Huberman does a pretty good job of doing his background research and figuring out what has the science to back it up. I have a kind of a priority list in terms of like the base level of supplements that I think most humans should be taking, whether or not they should be doing for trying to fertility optimize. That include things like magnesium, vitamin D3, the caveat being there that you really want to get your serum levels checked before you supplement with D3. Um, Things like B12, great, another methyl donor. And then, more fertility specific stuff like L-acetylcarnitine and CoQ10. And, definitely recommend supplementing for everyone with a DHA EPA blend. The higher the better. And the science showing that mothers supplementation with DHA and EPA leading to larger brain size
Can
and
you unpack
faster
that? What is that
motor
that you're
skills.
talking about?
DHA and EPA are the
Oh, right,
omega-3s coming
right,
from
right, right.
fish oil. So yeah, so the high ratios of EPA and DHA, great. Those are also anti-inflammatory, so huge bonus there. And then then you can get into the more specific ones. Zinc can be a major one for men, but zinc is also affects your copper, so you want to be careful that you're not overdoing zinc. I was honestly shocked at Huberman's recommendations for zinc. It was like 100 milligrams or 150 milligrams a day. It was like crazy high. Maybe that's okay, I guess. I'm not a doctor. I don't make any prescriptions, and none of my clients are patients. So all I make are
I'm looking at it now.
recommendations.
His recommend is it said I wrote zinc lots for males, 120 milligrams 2 times per day with meals, increases testosterone big time.
Yeah, big time. But it's also it can script your copper. So I would take that with a little bit of like a grain of salt, whatever. There's a thing you can do called why am I blanking the name? It's essentially a liquid zinc test, aqueous zinc taste test. So you can buy aqueous zinc online, and you can look it up online, but aqueous zinc taste test. And the way that your taste buds respond to the zinc will help get a better understanding of like, am I severely deficient or am I like at a decent level? So there's things that you can do in that regard to like kind of self diagnose any deficiencies. But yeah, zinc's obviously critically important for spermatogenesis and testosterone.
Yeah, and he had L-carnitine on there as well, which I think he mentioned.
Yep, L-acetylcarnitine. Yep.
Garlic extract, coenzyme Q10,
CoQ10. Yeah,
and
I
then
mentioned that. Yeah, so that's a really important antioxidant. That's also shown for females, especially. That's shown to really kind of boost. So just to be clear, like men, we didn't get into this earlier, but spermatogenesis for men takes about 10 weeks. So 75 days approximately. It's a little different for each individual. And then another week to week and a half to like get to the end of its course, run its course. So men always felt like, oh, I'm producing sperm every single day. You are like, there is fresh sperm coming out theoretically every single day, but it's theoretically 3 months old, essentially. It's been in a 3-month formation process, and then that's just a recurring cycle. So, and with women, the eggs that you have as a woman were inside you when you were inside your mom. So essentially, like the eggs in my daughter, because she's a female, were inside my wife before my daughter was born. So there's like there's a real clear epigenetic transfer there of like the grandma into the mom into the daughter is like they were all in the same body at the same time. But in terms of the egg quality, that can degrade over time for females. I think that's pretty well understood and well known. And so things like CoQ10 can really work to kind of slow that rate of decline. It can kind of boost your egg quality. And so that could be something if you're an aging woman and you're listening to this, or you're a husband and you're thinking about your wife, CoQ10 can be a great one to like think about supplementing.
Yeah, his L-acetylcarotene supplementation recommend here is also supposedly good for sperm and egg quality.
Yeah.
And then
Okay, would you mind just holding on for just 20 seconds? I just need to let my cat out. Seems like he's trapped into my wife's art studio. 2 seconds.
I'm just going to rattle off a couple more supplements from the Huberman research I did for anyone who's interested. But some of these are like, I mean, we already mentioned omega-3 fatty acids. Liquid is apparently.
Apologies to your listeners for the quick.
No, it's okay. I was just going to read a couple more supplements that Huberman had recommended, which you'd already touched on omega-3s, right? Liquid being kind of the easiest.
Yep.
There's a couple here that are hard to pronounce, but myo-inositol.
Myo-inositol. Yep. That's one I have less experience with, but yeah, he has some great studies on that. I think I haven't listened to that podcast in a year or two.
I don't remember when it came out, and then Tonga Ali and Shilajit, another 2 on here.
Shilajit. Yeah. So Shilajit's like the black ooze coming out of the Himalaya. Have you ever had it? It's like this like primordial ooze that squeezes out of the mountains of like the Himalaya. I've got a friend who was into it a few years ago. It's like this like mineral rich, deep like earth tar.
That's wild.
So I can see how that might be really great. I've never taken that as well. I think supplementation has a place. I don't think that it replaces a whole food, really nutrient dense diet at all. But I mean, given our modern agricultural practices, there is very clear science to show that our magnesium in the soil is significantly depleted. And so things like magnesium are critical. Something like, I'm getting the number wrong, so I hesitate to even say it, but a very large percentage of the American population is theoretically magnesium deficient. It's critical for sleep and hormones and all this stuff. So a few of them are just like non-debatable in my mind. But the kind of the more esoteric ones, if you really want to do it. I haven't done those last 3, myo-inositol, Tonga Ali, and
I don't think I'm not going to go way down the rabbit hole of supplements. I'm more interested in like 80-20 approach, take the stuff that's super critical that I know I'm probably deficient in, and I'm probably going to get some blood work done to find out as well. But I know D3 in the past, and my blood panels in the past has been low. And I think that's another one of those.
Huge. That's a huge one for fertility and everything else. And like, I am always shocked at how much I can supplement for my own levels when it's ideally you test every 3 months for D3 to see like what your supplementation is doing and like heavy duty supplement. And I think I may still have some sort of like latent viral infection from this tropical illness a few years ago. And so I do pretty consistent blood lab analysis to still trying to dial it in. Honestly, it's a game of detective, but do all I can to keep my D3 levels up. They play an important role.
Absolutely. And then hydration, just generally, what is it, like an ounce of water per pound of body weight, or is that about right? 1 to 2, depending on how much exercise you're doing.
Yeah, I mean that's actually a lot. Most people say an ounce per half
up to 1.
Weight.
That's what it was, 0.5 to 1, depending on if you're doing extraneous exercise. And
so if you're 150 pounds, 75 ounces, you're drinking like 4 liters a day. You're drinking a gallon a day, essentially. You know what I mean? No, excuse me. 2.5 liters a day. You know what I mean?
And then
would be the minimum
as quality as possible. Don't drink it. Your city tap water is probably not awesome.
Don't drink your city tap water. And the one thing we didn't touch on was like the adaptogens. I think what you're reading off of is like that list you have is maybe like a little infographic I had on my website. In that, I'm actually really referring to this term methyl adaptogens or epigenetic adaptogens. And that's a term coined by this Dr. Kara Fitzgerald, but it's essentially the polyphenols that really are polyphenol-rich plant. Polyphenols are essentially a plant molecule that occur in really deep, richly colored plants. And so I really want to stress, like, eat the rainbow, like the widest variety of deep, rich color that you can eat in a single day, the better. If you can eat 30 different vegetables in a single day, great. Like,
but
do it, fruits. Stack it on, and go for like not fruits. I do recommend eating berries. Berries are really high in polyphenol. So blueberries, blackberries, strawberries, those are low glycemic and they have a ton of nutrients and a ton of polyphenols. but generally I would not recommend stacking
like
on
bananas
fruits.
and apples and stuff, no go, but the berries
No,
are okay.
no.
And
Yep.
avocados are technically a
And
fruit, but those are great, right? For the fat side.
yeah, avocados, lemons, and limes also okay. Avocados great. It's the
Yeah.
monounsaturated fat. So there's great science showing like cognitive boost to avocado and all that stuff. But yeah, so the adaptogens being those polyphenols. So really, and then they say all of this. I would highly strongly recommend that you eat organic. So not only are you going to get less pesticides, we'll talk about impurity, but there's some meta-analysis to suggest that not only do organic foods have more nutrient content, but they're higher in polyphenols as well because they're slightly stressed during the growing periods, and the polyphenols are produced in the plants as a response to environmental stress.
This is a good segue. Organic is a good segue into purity because the non-organic shit,
Cheers.
The non-organic shit is usually sprayed with some stuff that you do not want to put into your body, right? And so that's one thing that Shauna Swan recommends a lot in her book is making sure your food is organic sourced if you can, because so much of what we're doing in industrial agriculture is absolutely insane when you think about it. Like when you just zoom out and you think about it, like we've create these chemicals that are novel introductions to a biosphere, right? Like in other words, they're the plants that we're eating and that we're growing didn't evolve with these synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and things like that. And then we're just depleting the topsoil by monocrop farming. So we have to use the synthetic fertilizer to make the stuff actually grow. And because it's all monocropped and there's no natural immunity in these plants, they're susceptible to disease and pests. And so they have to be sprayed with Roundup and different types of poison. So basically, our food is in this kind of, a lot of the food, and if you think about it from like the percentage of food in the grocery store, it's an insane percentage. It's a lot, probably 80% or more of what is in that food is coming from these sort of less than optimal and at worst insane types of growing food and ways of doing agriculture, not just for health, but for the environment and the biosphere. It's extremely toxic for the ecosystem, and all that stuff's running off into the water supply and the rivers, and then also we're depleting the topsoil. And it's just it's a bummer of a story. But when it comes to purity, what are give me an 80-20 approach to how I can unfuck myself here.
Yeah, the pesticides is a big one. Organic is ideal. There was a study that came out recently that showed like two commonly used pesticides significantly affecting sperm count and decreasing male fertility. So organic, great place to start. I recognize financially it's not always available. You can use EWG, Environmental Working Group, has a clean 15 and dirty dozen. So they rate like the produce that has the most pesticide use and the produce that has the least pesticide use. So avocados, for an example, is a clean 15. It's one of the top clean 15 produce. And
what's that resource to find that list?
It's Environmental Working Group. So EWG, I think .org likely. They're a great resource both for analyzing pesticide use in produce, but they also offer like a consumer guide. And I think they have an EWG app that allows you to scan barcodes on any sort of cosmetic or personal care item. And they'll rate it, 1 to 5 essentially based on
that's so dope
harm.
that exists.
Yeah, it's great. It's great for baby products. So, great. Use it for like any sort of.
I had some friends
really,
that I think it might be that app or it was a different one just like it, but they went and scanned their cosmetics and they ended up like getting rid of, I think 80% of their shower product. I mean, just everything in their bathroom because it was all full of all these phthalates and shit that, it was all getting terrible scores on that rating.
Yeah. I mean, you could think of the purity like, it's purity because it fits nicely in the SPERM acronym, but it's really environmental toxins. And so they can get into your body in any number of ways, but essentially skin contact, the air you breathe, the water you drink, the food you eat, and then, there's like the radiation aspect of any sort of cellular radiation or microwave radiation or, radio wave radiation.
Yeah. So eat organic, right? So like that makes
okay, so diving back in, the 80-20. So eat organic, you want to try to cut out your plastic usage. That's the biggest one for endocrine disruption. Phthalates are basically plasticizers that are put into plastics that help make the plastic malleable. So this is like cling wrap and plastic bags and all like the liners of, it's like they're hiding everywhere. They're hiding in the coffee cups. Like any paper
Like
coffee
anything
cup is lined with
anything
plastic. Any
disposable
paper,
is lined with this stuff, right?
yeah.
Because
So
it's
paper
like the
plates,
wax is, it's
paper
like the
cups. It's not actually
surface shit on it that stops it from getting like greasy and falling
falling
apart. Yeah,
apart in your
exactly.
hand. Yeah. Store receipts covered in BPA. BPA is an endocrine disruptor. Scented candles. Phthalates are often used in all sorts of different synthetic fragrances. Any sort of synthetic scent. So if it says like scent, essentially fragrance on your cosmetic or your beauty product or whatever, it's generally a phthalate unless it says otherwise. So that's a huge place to start. So phthalates are a class of chemicals. They're generally associated with plastics, but they can also be associated with scents. And they are a large part of a larger class of chemicals called endocrine disrupting chemicals that we touched on earlier. These are chemicals that can come into your body and completely disrupt your hormone balance. And so plastics are a huge part of that. Endocrine disruptors, xenoestrogens, all these different things. So plastics is a huge one. And then the PFAS, the forever chemicals that you talked about earlier. So those are things like Teflon, Gore-Tex. They found these chemicals globally, worldwide, in the Arctic and the Antarctic, and they're everywhere. And so, and you can't get them out of your body, really, at least as far as we've discovered so far. So I would literally go home right now and throw away all your nonstick pans. Literally, like, don't take them to the thrift store because you're just doing someone else harm. And swap it out for stainless steel or cast iron, which you can probably also find at the thrift store, hopefully. And then, so that's big on the cooking. That's, there's all synthetics. I mean, for men, polyester is an issue. Polyester is the plastic. You wear it, it rubs on your skin day in and day out. I would recommend not exercising, at least not sweating in any sort of polyester.
Really?
I would try to get rid of, I mean, ideally, if you're trying to optimize, I would try to get rid of the microplastics that are basically rubbing on your skin at
is
all
that
times.
true of all synthetic clothing blends, like or just polyester?
Well, it depends on synthetic. It depends on if you mean like a
Like
modal or if you
workout
mean
clothes
like
these days are full of all kinds of different synthetics. Yeah, exactly. So
chemicals.
maybe you just stick with what, like just cotton. Like what do you wear?
I mean, I like cotton
Yeah.
and wool. If it's summertime, I wear cotton because if I sweat, it's okay. It dries out. If it's wintertime, I wear wool because if I sweat, it's
Right.
okay. I stay warm.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. I think most of my clothes are probably either cotton or wool, but
You'd be surprised. I went through, I'm like, oh yeah, all my nice cotton t-shirts. And I started looking at labels and everyone's 50-50. 50 cotton, 50 poly, 50
yeah,
cotton,
I'm a
50
little
poly. Never seen the
concerned
one. I'm
now
like,
because like
what?
I wear a lot of Prana clothing and it's so functional and stretchy and like comfortable, and my suspicion is that I'm going to find out that there's some sort of synthetics in the like elastic type.
I mean, elastane is in there. There's yeah. I mean, you're not gonna get rid of it completely. And also, like, ideally, if it's like, ideally you can wear like an undershirt or at least make your boxers cotton. You know what I mean? That you're never gonna, that's the thing. 80-20, what you're referencing. I think most you probably used it before, so your listeners probably know. But it's the Pareto's law. It's like optimize for 80% and let 20% slide. I like to think of it as 90-10, just because
Well,
another shit trying to get through
another
on
way
that
to say
20%.
it too. I mean, so you're saying there's
yeah.
a diminishing return, right? So you can't get every single thing out of your environment. But another way to look at Pareto's law would be that the 20% of the worst causes, maybe it's the pans, maybe it's the cosmetics, and they're causing 80%
of your
of the damage.
problems.
So it's like we want to find those real problem childs and get rid of them. I don't know if it's like if you're a little bit of elastane in your stretchy workout pants, it's probably not as big of a deal as cooking on something that's constantly exposing your food to some shit that's never going to leave your fucking body. Which I'm upset about this because I know my pans are nonstick, and this is like hurting my soul. This hurts. So I need to throw this away immediately.
Yeah, I mean, plastic water bottles, obviously, plastic jugs, food in plastic, microwaving in plastic. I mean, plastic is the worst if it's heated or if it's fat. If there's fat in it. So you definitely want to buy all your oils in glass. You never want to heat any food in plastic.
Interesting. So even like buying a nut butter in a plastic container, because it's got a lot of high fat content in the nut butter, do you think that the nut butter fat's absorbing phthalates from the plastic container?
Yes. coconut oil inside a can.
Yeah. So
Same thing.
basically buy
Coconut
that
milk, I
shit
mean.
in glass jars. And we just bought a bunch of glass storage, little organizers for our pantry because like we don't want to store stuff in plastic. But just finding it and buying it in non-plastic is a fucking challenge. Like, yeah,
It's more expensive too. Yeah.
it's so baked into our just-in-time economy and our convenience and our 2-hour fucking delivery from Amazon, 2-day shipping with Amazon. It's like everything's boxed and packaged and wrapped and preserved through these chemicals. So, I mean, there's a reason that we use them. It's because it keeps the nature out. It keeps the thing from degrading, it keeps it from breaking down. But it's also like it's a trade-off, and we're putting all these like Gore-Tex, for example. I mean, it keeps you fucking dry. Like Gore-Tex is nice if you're out in the, out in the outdoors, you're trying to stay dry for sure.
I mean, Patagonia is now manufacturing recycled Gore-Tex, waterproof, triple layer, perfluorocarbonate free, so PFC free. So there are, pioneering brands like Patagonia that are offering PF free, PFS free,
right.
PFC free.
So you said xenoestrogens, which are basically like BPA. Is that one of the example of xenoestrogen?
Yeah, I mean, the caveat there is like there's the regrettable substitution thing where, BPA, everyone villainized it. And so all the brands switched to BPF and they just put BPA free on their cans. And then as soon as BPF gets hammered, they'll switch to BPS, or they're already using BPS.
Yeah.
And it's a can of worms. And, there's something like 85,000, probably 80, 90,000 commercial chemicals at this point. And, none of them, it's like the whole thing of like, none of them have been checked yet. And they're all out there. And it's like the innocent till proven guilty thing where they're all just assumed to be innocent and they're all actually guilty. And then when one gets hammered, they just swap it out for one that hasn't been hammered yet. Yeah. And so, you say like, we can clean up our environment. You were saying that earlier. And like, I totally agree. We have the capability to. The human coordination part is definitely the kicker. I think in Shauna Swan's book, I'm trying to remember, but I think she talks about asbestos, and she's talking about how it took 100 years, a century for asbestos
for the paradigm to shift.
They knew it was bad for 100 years.
And it's still being used now. Like there's still people in the world using it.
We actually don't have that luxury of median sperm counts are going to reach 0 by 2045. Like we might not, it's not a 2045, not very far away.
It's really grim when you start to add all this up. Like the asbestos example, I think the first paper was in like the 20s, like the first scientist saying there's something here to look at. And it's 100 years since then, and there's still asbestos in the environment, and there's still some countries that aren't, making it illegal to use. So it's not even fully out of the, it hasn't even fully shifted even now. And, to your point, like, you listen to guys like Schmachenberger talk about this, and it starts to like land, and you're like, oh my God, what do we even do? Because, you think about the repercussions of one of these chemicals, right? Like lead, for example, being in gasoline, lead being used in gasoline to help prevent engine knocking. And then we're taking a neurotoxin called lead, and we're aerosolizing it by burning gasoline in cars in a combustion engine. And you're aerosolizing a fucking neurotoxin, and everyone's breathing it in. And then the repercussions of that are estimated to be, like 4x increase in violence and 1 billion IQ points across the planet that dropped, and like all this crazy shit from one chemical that we're tracking. And it took decades to get the regulation to catch up, to get lead out of gasoline. So, to your point, we don't have what we've done is we've and without making this a long tangent, we've said, oh, the free market will just magically solve all the problems. And what the free market actually does, I mean, it does a lot of things, but one of them is that it creates an incentive to externalize the costs of what you're truly doing as far as business goes. And so I don't have to pay the downstream costs of, the cost to Josh's health from my toxin that I'm putting in his body or in the environment. Coca-Cola is not internalizing the costs of the plastic pollution from their product, or the diabetes from their product, or the whatever else from their product. And if they don't have to internalize the costs, then there's always going to be an incentive to cut those corners and to move fast and break things and to roll products out without full battery of testing, and running these trials. Like you said, you don't have to actually prove that these things, it's like innocent until proven guilty, which is absurd given the fact that you can create a forever chemical that not only can cause damage now, but it's just like, okay, we can't even undo this. It's just in the environment now.
Well, the crazy part is that there's science that shows that through the epigenetic inheritance stuff, that a male who's subjected to a chemical that reduces his fertility, if he has a son and that son is subjected to the same chemical, it's a compounding effect and it reduces his fertility even more, the son's. And if his son is exposed to the same chemical, it reduces his fertility even more. And so you get this like compounding exponential rate of fertility decline through this single chemical getting exposed, to multiple generations of the same male line.
It is insane. It's hard to approach this subject with and keep hope for the future, to be honest. It's one of the, there's a few of these, like when you start to dive into existential risk in any domain and you go sufficiently far enough, you start to just like, lose hope. So it's hard to navigate the terrain and be like, okay.
I mean, there's a reason. The reason they kept us at 90 seconds to midnight, I think, last week or whatever that was. Did you see that? The Union of Atomic Scientists, they've got like,
I know about the clock, but I don't know what you mean by last week.
They reset it last week. They every year they basically say like, here's how close we are to calamity. And they set it, I think, second week of January or whatever. And so they sent it last week, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago. And it's basically like 90 seconds to midnight, I think.
Which that's what they set it at. Which was probably the lowest it's ever been. I don't know.
No, one of the highest.
What I mean by lowest is lowest amount of seconds. But highest.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The last 3 years have stayed the same though.
Okay.
So not it.
Yeah, which is obviously just a number. I mean, like, people, it's a meaningless number, but like, you shouldn't feel comfortable because it's like, oh, we still got 90 seconds.
Yeah, it's abstract. It's too abstract. People don't get it. They're like, oh, that's so abstract. It doesn't, whatever.
It doesn't land. And when you start to read a book like Shauna Swan's book, it starts to land and you're like, Jesus.
But it's heavy. The book's kind of slow to get through, for me at least it was, because it's just like, it's heavy. It's like, man, I can't. I don't want to read anymore of this.
I got to put it down and you process.
Man,
she did a podcast with Rogan that was really good. If you guys want more of a bite-sized,
good.
Yeah, that's how I got exposed to her originally. So I'll link to that too for anyone who wants to get more of a. It's not like it's just surface level. She still presents the case really well in a 3-hour conversation, 2-hour conversation, or whatever it was. Okay, so I think it's.
We better keep buzzing.
We got some more stuff to get through, and we can linger on purity for a while and just be dark. But
okay. Another aspect of my program though is just like optimizing the detox. So that's a whole nother component. It's like minimize exposure, and then do all you can to optimize the detox. And we'll get into that another time. But jumping on to E, exercise. So that's the whole body thing. So there's different types of exercise that affect our hormones differently. Things like weight training, resistance training have different effects on testosterone and cardio. There's also the fact that cardio can be excessive. So there's again, the Goldilocks zone. That's kind of a consistent theme in my work, in my program, is like there is deficiency and there is excess. And we're really trying to find that sweet spot. And so you don't want to have chronic inflammatory cardio. I think some people can really get addicted to that feeling. I understand it, of just like incessant cardio and exercise. And it's kind of a dangerous line because you can be stimulating chronic inflammation. And then, so it's really about finding the moderation of different types of exercise in an appropriate level for your physiology. And then the other aspects of the exercise component that I work with is related to kind of like posture and temperature. Things like heat are very bad for spermatogenesis. There's a reason why your testicles are on the outside of your body. They need to be a number of degrees cooler than the inside of your body for sperm formation. And so it's just kind of bringing awareness. My program that I've developed, this whole methodology, is really about education. And I really strongly believe that like an informed client will hopefully be more motivated to implement. And so I try to provide like the worldview shift, like here's like the change of worldview, and now like here's the action steps that you can use to implement. You know, like a standing desk. Great, I've been standing this whole podcast.
You're making me want to stand up. I've
They
been
say
sitting,
is
and didn't want to make the noise of my desk rising, but you've just given me the cue, so I'm doing it.
Do it. Yeah, do it. Yeah, I mean, they say sitting is the new smoking.
And then,
so
beautiful! My backdrop is just short enough, so like you guys get to see that I actually have a fucking backdrop behind me. This is perfect.
Just do a little crouch, you know.
Right, it feels good to stand. You're right, but like to your point though about the testicles being on the outside of your body and stuff. Apparently, just sitting, if you have like thicker thighs and more overweight people, are associated with lower sperm counts because of the temperature increase in your legs. And then sauna, which is a real bummer for me. I love to sauna, and it's a lot of health benefits for sauna. But if you're trying to conceive, it's probably a good idea to not sauna for that first.
It kind of depends on where you're at in your journey is kind of how I take that one. You know, sauna can be so beneficial for detox that if you're 6 months out or something, you're like, I'm going to conceive in 6 months. I would tend to recommend sauna with a cool pack in your shorts, and just try to like really optimize the benefits of sauna for detox for 3 months or something. You know, in general, as I remember, the science is generally showing that about a 50% decline in sperm from a single heat exposure event. So that's a hot tub or a sauna that lasts for about 3 months, you know, and it's a bell-shaped curve. It's not like 50% dead for 3 months. Like there's a curve there, but there's a decline the number of weeks out that persists and then tapers off. But yeah, heat's something to be aware of. Definitely BMI is important. You know, you and I have touched on that a little bit. Obesity plays a big effect on fertility for a ton of different reasons. You know, again, to just bring those kind of like 4 overarching themes of inflammation, oxidative stress, DNA methylation, and hormone balancing from the hormone perspective with the body. Things like obesity can change the ratio because of enzymes like aromatase that can essentially convert testosterone into estrogen. So there's an enzyme in fat that can convert testosterone into estrogen, and that can also screw up your testosterone levels, and it can screw up your your spermatogenesis. So yeah, there's a whole bunch to unpack in that exercise component, but you get the gist of it. It's related to body and function and weight and movement and temperature.
From just a 80-20 approach, then would I be correct in saying regular daily functional movement and exercise, you know, not too much though, like it's the Goldilocks zone. You don't want to overdo it and overstress yourself. But like right now, for example, I have kind of like my daily habit, one of my habits is kind of a power hour where I'm getting some good movement in. It's cardio a couple times a week. Great. 2 days a week is zone 2, so pretty low intensity cardio. And then 1 day a week is VO2 max. So it's just once per week that I'm doing like high intensity cardio. And then day for lower body resistance, day for upper body resistance, and day for just like a full body yoga practice.
You've been following Huberman's daily practice.
I kind of adapted it a bit because I don't go to the gym.
So funny. Huberman and who was it? Tim Ferriss, I think, went so deep onto like Huberman's like daily practice. I got overwhelmed. I was like, oh my God, how does this guy do all the things he does?
Too much. But yeah, I
was like, you're doing
it's just like it's all simple body weight calisthenic type stuff and some cardio, running. And I swim in the pool, so it's like it's really minimal. The cold exposure is nice. I get the pool here while it's still cold. It's nice. But yeah, and obviously posture, breathing properly, and that kind of stuff.
Nasal breathing is obviously
which a lot of people don't know about, but you should be mouth taping at night if you're, most of us open our mouths and breathe through our mouths at night. And during the day, like just focusing on nasal breathing, because that's what your nose is for. And James Nestor's got a great book.
I've been on it. Yeah, that is a great book. I've been on a deep journey on that for the last few years myself, actually doing a tremendous amount of structural work in my skull and face to enhance my nasal breathing capability. So that's a whole nother topic for another podcast, but I'm all about it.
But just briefly, breathing changes your face. Like it changes the whole structure of your face. And if you're mouth breathing, you kind of get a smaller palate, like everything's all scrunched in.
I've been doing this cranial facial release. Have you heard of it? Internal nasal
I haven't
ballooning.
heard of it.
Yeah, it's awesome. The guy sticks the balloon up your nose and then rapidly inflates it and pops your face from the
God, that
inside
sounds
out.
intense.
Man, it's intense, but it will change your nasal
Yeah,
breathing like nothing
actually, I'm
else.
really curious about that because I have still, even now, I've opened it a lot just with breath work. I don't know
Deviated
if I got a
septum or something.
deviated septum or not, but my left nostril is smaller than my right, and I get less airflow through my left side. It's more prone to kind of like stuffing up a little bit, but yeah.
You should try it. You got to get a good practitioner, but it's a game changer. It's like a minimum. I think it's like 5-6 sessions ideally over a couple
So
months. But
let's.
yeah,
I know we're 2.5
keep
hours
going.
in,
Keep
so I'm
going.
trying to
All
like
right.
get us to the fucking finish
Oh
line here.
shit.
I don't want to.
All right. I mean, we
Well,
call
I
it
know,
anytime you want, man.
I'm super grateful for your time because this is. It's not that I'm needing to go or anything. It's that I want to be mindful of the time for you.
Stay on track.
And for the
I feel it.
listeners. So,
Yeah.
because I know people's attention spans are not what they used to be these days. You know. Yeah.
8 seconds. They left a long time ago,
exactly.
mate.
It's just me and you in here. It's funny because like sperm counts are declining, but attention spans already fucking way gone. All right, so rest is all, obviously foundation of health in general. Sleep is like most primary thing to focus on, probably, if you were just picking one metric to optimize for your health, right? Would you agree sleep's like kind of at the top of the list?
Yeah. I mean, hard for me to like prioritize any one of those in terms of fertility health, but yeah, sleep is like all encompassing for all aspects of your health, especially just for your hormones. Obviously, it's also like, apoptosis and all these different aspects of your cellular cycling and regeneration and all that occurs during your sleep. So for my program that I offer, I offer a couple different programs. We can get into that another time, but essentially it's really about optimizing your sleep quality. And there's a bunch of different ways you can do that, but the benefits are, better hormonal balance, less inflammation, less oxidative stress, all those things that we talked about before, and just like more energy. So yeah, really, really critical sleep. And I think it's underestimated in our modern society, kind of like undervalued,
And just to
promoted.
offer my sort of 80-20 take on that would be focusing on the light. Light is one of the primary inputs that you can control as far as optimizing sleep. So reduction of artificial light, especially blue light, at night or after sunset, and then in the morning, making sure you're getting sunlight directly in your eyes. Horizontal sunlight is optimal. So as the sun's rising would be best, and getting sunlight even directly. If it's horizontal, you can get it directly and look at the sun and get directly in your eyes, which is perfect. And that kind of jumpstarts your circadian clock, getting that cortisol pulse and kind of setting you up for later on at the end of the day when the sun's going down, getting outside again, getting sunlight, sunset, evening light in your eyes, and stimulating that sort of melatonin release. So basically the relationship, if you just think about it, it's kind of obvious, but we evolved without electricity and without artificial light. So there's only the sun. And it's just like, the biology evolved with that rhythm of the solar cycle and the rhythm of the Earth's turning. So now we're talking, planetary motions and shit. But basically,
Totally.
other than that, I would say, so darkness is key to sleep, but cold is also important. So you want it to be a cool environment.
Temperature is a big one. Yeah.
And under some blankets, like some weighted blankets is nice. Cool. So anything else about sleep, that you might want to add that we haven't touched on? I mean, there's obviously a whole rabbit hole.
I mean, there's lots more to unpack there, but I think you got to give people at least a good place to start. That early sunlight in the morning, there's receptors in your eyes that will generally start to trigger a melatonin pulse about 16 hours later. So like if you get that really first early sunlight, then your like body's setting up your circadian rhythm for the proper cycling. And if you're having trouble going to sleep earlier, I used to be a complete night owl. My lifestyle was such that I would stay awake till 1 a.m., 2 a.m. consistently and sleep in, and just had a much late, I'd be working outside on my farm until 10 p.m., come in, eat a late dinner, 10 p.m., 10:30 is like very European style. I used to live in Europe. And so then like just was so shifted. And so like to bring that back to be on track with the sun is like, do it gradually, like just work on like 15 minutes earlier every day. And like, instead of setting your alarm clock, set your like bedtime clock of like, okay, now's my time to go to sleep. Like this is bedtime, and like turn down the lights, turn off all the blue lights, turn off the fluorescent lights, turn on some candles, like give yourself an hour of wind down, turn your screens off. I mean, there's lots more to unpack on the sleep, but you know, just get started on trying to like go to sleep at the same time every night. Like there's a lot there, but people give people a place to start.
I mean, there's a couple of hacks. Like nowadays, so much of our lighting is programmable through an app, through software. So if you can just get smart bulbs and
watch out for that Bluetooth, man.
For sure. Everything's EMFs and Bluetooth. And we didn't really talk about EMFs much in the purity section, but everything is creating radiation.
That's a part of it too. The heat.
But still, like if you can create these automations where, you know, you don't have to even choose, your house just automatically goes into evening mode for you. That's a bonus, right?
I've got some remodels to do before I get there.
That's something I'm obsessed with. And what's weird, once you make the switch to really thinking about light intake in the PM hours when it's dark outside, you make the switch and you're, you know, around red light and like lower light and that kind of thing. Specifically, no above head super bright blue lights, like you're getting rid of those. Once you make that switch, and one of those switches is my phone screen. I have a color filter you can create a shortcut through, you know, like if you have an iPhone where you can just create like a hotkey shortcut. So all I have to do is click my home button 3 times and my screen turns red and it just filters the color. So basically filtering out the negative light as much as you can. Once you adapt to that, you start to realize how sensitive we are to light. And it's like, as soon as you go out of your environment, the nice little cave you've created, and you go into Las Vegas, which is where I'm at, I'm like, oh my God, it's like, it's bright everywhere all the time. It's never dark here. You know, I can see a blue like haze just coming from the orb, the giant sphere that's been built in Las Vegas. It's just constantly blasting. Like I can't imagine the people who live like just a couple streets away from it. You know, you have to have blackout blinds just to, you know, have any semblance of darkness. But by the way, blackout blinds for sleep are a huge win for sure if you're in a city. So, and then I was going to say next, mindset.
Go ahead. Mindset.
So actually, mindset's a huge one second, just because I feel like we'd be remiss to not mention caffeine on the rest side. It's kind of an important piece. So what's your take on caffeine for fertility and for sleep?
I go caffeine free. You know, the science is mixed. It's mixed. Most of the science is from a female perspective. And the science, I think, generally tends to say like less than 200 milligrams of caffeine a day has no adverse effect on female fertility. You know, I specialize in male fertility, so I could be getting that slightly wrong. I obviously have a partner and a wife who I care about and try to help her as well. So that's on the female side. On the male side, I don't know fertility's direct effect on like total sperm count, morphology, motility, that sort of stuff, but I do know the effect that it has on circadian rhythm and sleep. And so I advocate a no caffeine-free lifestyle. I mean, to go from, you know, a decent amount of substances to none a few years ago. I mean, I won't say none, but none of the main substances. I eat food and drink water, but you know, I'm not smoking anything. I don't drink alcohol. I don't really do caffeine when I'm on a fertility boosting preparation scenario that I'm on now. So it can just screw up your circadian rhythm, essentially, you know, especially if you're drinking too much caffeine or eating too much caffeine late in the day. 1 cup of coffee in the morning is probably not going to screw you up. It's not going to throw you out of loop. If that's coffee and you want to use some of your grass-fed, you know, AA butter, do it. I won't tell you not to. For me, what I did is I transitioned to half calf and then I transitioned to decaf, and I occasionally still drink decaf. And now I've been drinking more white and green tea. The white and green tea are really high in polyphenols. So then you're getting a ton of the methylation boosters.
You swapped it out.
You're still getting less. You're getting less caffeine. You know, I'm still getting a little bit of caffeine. I think it's like 40.
Some of those green teas.
Yeah, the green teas depends on your green tea. The green tea I'm drinking is like 20 to 30 milligrams per large cup or something. Coffees, you know, much higher. I mean,
yerba mate is actually pretty, I think, one of the highest of the teas as well. But I'm with you on that. Like reducing the caffeine intake. Also, making sure that you're not doing it late in the day. So if you're waking up with the sun at 6 or 7 a.m., you're not wanting to take any caffeine and after like 9 a.m. or 10 a.m., right? Because you have a 12-hour half-life for that to get out of your system. And also,
and you want to take the caffeine after you've been awake for an hour and a half. Actually, it tends to work better, and you want to. Some people suggest, depending on the nutritional therapist you talk to, but it's better to get some food in your belly before you drink a bunch of coffee.
You want to let the adenosine get processed out of your brain. The adenosine is what makes you feel sleepy. So if you don't let that process out of your brain, you take the caffeine in, then essentially you're going to have a crash later when So
that's it. Unless you got that bulletproof going and you just keep stacking the butter in.
Yeah. No, I'm a big fan of coffee. So that's one of the vices I have not given up, even though I have done the thing where I went decaf for a while and then I moved in with my partner and she's got me back on the regular caffeine because she's a total junkie. But I'd love to transition to less caffeine. I've already, we skipped over this, but it goes without saying, if you're prepping for fertility, cutting out alcohol, but specifically cutting out smoking of any kind for men and women as well. But smoking is really bad for sperm, right?
Yeah. So I'm glad you touched on that because it's a huge major point. Didn't mean to skip it. My whole methodology is pretty in depth. So we're obviously skipping a bunch of different stuff here, just to be clear. Like, this isn't a comprehensive analysis of exactly how to optimize, but this kind of gives you the 80-20, or not really the 80-20, but at least like the high level kind of like overview. And smoking is not good. And a big part of the smoking is it adds oxidative stress into your seminal fluid. And so your semen and your sperm are obviously two different things. Your sperm is added to your seminal fluid. And if the oxidative stress in your seminal fluid can really change the composition of your sperm and cause degradation there. And so smoking or vaping can really degrade that. And marijuana is also detrimental. So I know, sometimes that can be hard to change. And also there's really a beauty for me, myself personally. I was a cannabis user for many years and kind of like a social drinker, I guess. Didn't drink that much, but definitely enjoyed alcohol, I would say weekly. And sort of take both of those substances out of my life a number of years ago, I think was something I'd kind of been wanting to do for many years and hadn't found the motivation. And that was really the beauty of preconception prep for me, was really, I externalized my motivation source. And that's something that like I had been trying to find motivation to like create life change and get fitter and wake up at 6 a.m. or 5 a.m. and get exercise and meditate and do all the things. And like, I couldn't find the motivation. And then as soon as I like externalized it and was like, oh my God, I'm doing this for the long-term future health of my child. And I only have to do it for like 9 months or 10 months or whatever. And that's like a sacrifice I'm willing to make for their like 80 years of living. Even if it's like a 1% chance that their life's going to be better, it's worth it to me to do that. And in response, I got the enormously added boost of like an externalized motivation source that allowed me to shift my life to a completely new chapter that I'm in now.
Yeah, you make a really good point, which is that, and this is, I think, a rule that's true in most cases, which is that doing the thing that's optimal for your fertility and for your child is actually better for your quality of life. It's actually going to be good for you in the now as well. I mean, getting off of any substances that you're dependent on is going to be good for you for sure. And these lifestyle changes that we've been talking about are for the most part all going to be just beneficial to your quality of life. Like, there's a couple things on here, like for example, sauna, where I find that using the sauna, I really enjoy, and it adds to my quality of life and my my health. But it's bad for sperm counts. Like,
you could take 4 or 5 months off
right now. So not a big deal. And like you said, if it makes even a small percentage increase in the probability of a healthier child, it's worth it, right? So definitely agree with you on that. So let's just go through mindset. It's the last one here, M for mindset.
So mindset is, should be first, as I was saying, because it's so powerful and important. And in the process I teach, I do definitely touch on it at the beginning. It's last because of its convenient place in sperm, and because it's a good way to wrap everything up and really, let people out the door feeling empowered and motivated to keep optimizing this change after we work together. And so these are stress reduction techniques like breathing, things like, some of the things that I think Huberman talks about, some of the breath techniques. I haven't listened to that many Huberman podcasts, but a number of them. And things like ways to find motivation. And even one of those things I just mentioned of like being able to find that future child as an externalized motivation source. And then ways to reduce cortisol response. So psychological sighs, essentially where you inhale, and then when I'm at the peak of my inhale, I'd inhale again, and then a slow exhale out of my nose. So just like things like that can really kind of like reset our autonomous nervous system.
Yeah, so basically mindfulness practices and techniques to reduce stress, and but also mindset in general around being motivated and why you're doing what you're doing with your life, having positive just affect, positive orientation in general is probably it's actually weird. I don't know if that's quantifiable, but I'm sure that has quite a big impact on health and fertility, right?
I mean, one thing we haven't touched on at all, and it's too deep a rabbit hole to dive too far in, but is this whole idea of like epigenetics is also kind of the way that science explains trauma inheritance. And so I'm getting it's a little bit of a tangent, but essentially there's proof that trauma changes your epigenetic DNA methylation markers in a way that is hereditable. So you can inherit trauma experience. And I was in this really interesting conversation over New Year's. I went to a really nice private event at my friend's retreat center called Bayul, and I was in a great conversation there with this woman, and we were talking about the potential for kind of like ecstatic experience, the birth of your first child, falling in love, all these experiences, to kind of do the opposite, to kind of reset. And there's not science that I'm aware of yet that's really studying the effect that these experiences could be having on changing your methylation and your epigenetic expression, but there's the potential for that. So this idea that like, while trauma can affect epigenetic expression, so too can like positive joy and laughter and beauty and love and appreciation. And so like really trying to embody that and bring that forward is very important and can have profound effects that are maybe not as well understood scientifically, but they're there. You can feel them. And then, all of that kind of like the whole mindset thing for me is really wrapped up in also just like a meditative practice, because I really strongly believe that when I meditate, I'm more present with my family, I'm more stable, I'm less reactive. And a huge component of this whole dynamic that we haven't talked about is that like having a child is, at least for a while, a two-person dynamic in most cases. It's not always the case, but in most cases, there's some sort of two-person dynamic going on, and it can add a whole new level of like challenge, dynamic, joy, but like complexity to the system. And so finding ways to navigate that is really important. And I think the more you can set yourself up for that preemptively is really valuable. And so if people say like, oh, I don't have an hour of time to like do this preconception work, it's like, well, your kids are going to take a lot more than an hour of time. So like better like start carving that time out of your schedule now beforehand and just like, it's part of it. But
yeah, for sure.
You get
That's
where
a
I'm
good
coming
point. I don't know if I have much in the way to add to that, but just it seems like, to loop it back to what we're talking about in the riff about nihilism and despair, you're pretty much talking about creating the opposite conditions, right? And if nihilism and despair is preventing you from reproducing and has having an impact on fertility in the sense that it's people aren't even having the desire to start it in the first place, then what's the opposite mode, right? Which would be some sort of enthusiasm and inspiration for your life. And so what are the practices that can get you oriented in that direction would be one way to think about it, right? So there was one other thing here, and for sure.
Gratitude journaling,
cool.
There's
so
like all the things.
That's the end of the sperm methodology, which is like, it's funny you said this isn't a comprehensive, but there's so much, so it's fascinating that there's you really do have like a huge reservoir and wealth of knowledge here. So I can see this being definitely something that once you start to know how much you don't know, right? And that's how I feel right now. I'm feeling more and more humble about this whole enterprise of
Well, I really appreciate you having me on because, to be honest, a huge aspect of this whole thing is education and outreach and understanding. And in general, most men, I'll stick it out there and say that, suffer any sort of subfertility or infertility or anything in silence because there's like a taboo or a social stigma about talking about it because it's related to masculinity. I really want to break that taboo and stigma and really bring this conversation into the living room and the kitchen and the friend group and like the hike and all these things. It's very, very important that we like completely break that stigma because they say 1 in 6 couples will experience infertility nowadays. That's 1 in 12 men. That means someone you know, likely a close friend of yours, may be experiencing this in silence. And so like, it's really important that we continue the conversation. And like, I feel like I have a lot of knowledge to share, but there's not always an open forum to talk about this stuff.
Yeah,
So I
no,
really appreciate
absolutely.
you having me on.
I've got a couple of friends who have been in this exact dilemma where they've been trying to conceive for many years, another set of friends, it's like been like a decade, so it really is. And these are young people, it's like, this is a real phenomena. You're absolutely right. And we definitely do need to destigmatize it because it's not associated with your worth as a man. But it definitely does have that sort of it's almost an attack on your identity in a sense, right? Like if you have, it feels like what it seems like to me is that people who are experiencing fertility issues, it's kind of similar to erectile dysfunction or something, where there's this taboo, like, oh no, there's something wrong with me, or I'm not man enough or something. And it's about your worth or your identity as a man versus it being just like the reality of an environmental fertility and health crisis that we're kind of all living in right now. And the sooner that we can just acknowledge what's going on, the sooner we can actually start to correct course a little bit. And no reason to suffer in silence. Instead, just be like, hey, let's fucking support each other and figure out how to be some, I guess, fertile motherfuckers, the fathers of the future.
Yeah, I mean, you get future fathers. I like that term, and definitely like you get to choose how you respond to your reality. You didn't maybe get to pick your reality, but you do get to choose how you respond. And I'm here to provide support for men who are both experiencing that, and also for men like yourself who are really like excited to like optimize their health just for like get everything as healthy as humming as possible, so that any potential benefit is passed on and the pregnancy is easier and your wife has an easier time and it's just like the birth outcomes smoother, and all those things can be influenced by preconception health. And again, I just want to say like this is in many, in my mind, ideal situations, like this is a partnership. And so I champion you to like really support your wife in that preconception.
Yeah, we have a great dynamic
well
right now of mutual support, and she's equally motivated as I am. So she's the one, coming home with the glass containers and like changing shit out. Like she's listening to a whole other suite of podcasts and doing her side of it as well. So we're both pretty stoked and getting pretty motivated. We cutting out alcohol together and all cannabis together and like making a bunch of these changes together. So I think it's important, an understanding that getting out of this old mindset that it's just on the woman and that guys are just kind of home free. We've been talking for almost 3 hours. There's a couple other things, and I don't want to be long-winded, but I'm really curious about this one thing. I just did a podcast that will be out by the time this airs, I guess, which was with my friend Coda. I don't know if you know who Coda, you probably don't know him, but basically, because he's connected through FGP, so I figured you might have met him. But he's very interesting. He has a fascinating story. Basically, he's a born male, transitioned, went to becoming a trans woman, full operation, full everything, and then transitioned back to becoming just male. And now takes exogenous testosterone, presents as a man, acts as a man, very, very intelligent, very, very interesting, awesome person. And I did a podcast with him, and we just he took me on this journey through gender of his experience, and having experienced the whole, wave of that culture, of trans culture as well, and being on the inside of being kind of a woman, being inside of women's circles and stuff. But my question to you is, how how much of this, now that we've kind of laid out the landscape of this environmental crisis and all the toxins and chemicals in the environment and the impact that they have on fertility, we didn't really get too into the weeds about how phthalates specifically can impact, and endocrine disruptors can impact the release of testosterone while the fetus is developing, and can actually cause can negatively impact the sexualizing or the sexual development of a human, that's especially males, right? So my question to you is, like, how much of our kind of current, gender dysphoria, or whatever you want to call it, in the zeitgeist, do you think is around the biology, the biological, the downstream biological effects from the environment? How much of it do you think is just like environmental, in other words, versus I don't know, psychosocial, and and I don't know if I'm phrasing this question very intelligently, but I hope you understand what I'm saying. I'm wondering, like, I'm wondering, like, is
Absolutely.
this just
I
an
gotcha.
environmental phenomena? And if we were in a clean, natural ecosystem without these toxins and whatnot, and living in a natural sort of Paleolithic landscape or whatever, do you think this would be a thing, or maybe way less prevalent?
Sure. I won't say it's purely environmental. I won't go so far as to say that, but I will say that I think environmental plays a huge role in the way that the human species is internalizing gender. And this is a super
Sorry for
complex
like
topic.
throwing you
It's
into a
also kind
minefield
of
with this
a
question.
no, it's fine. A bit. I mean, politically and socially, it's definitely a minefield. But I'm happy to take my stand. I think that there's a complexity to it. It's gender. It's both who you're attracted to and what genders you're attracted to, and who you identify as a gender. And so there's kind of some complexity there. I don't. I wouldn't go so far as to say that I think environmental, like homosexuality, is caused from the environment necessarily, but I do think that gender identity can be swayed by environmental exposure. This is largely through the science on phthalates and endocrine disrupting chemicals. There's irrefutable science in my mind that very clearly shows that hormone disruption caused by things like phthalates not only affects through maternal exposure while the baby's in utero, can drastically affect not only like sexual formation in terms of like a smaller anogenital distance, so the distance between the basically genitals and the anus, or smaller penile length, or a micro penis. This is going to all be affected through phthalate exposure or endocrine disrupting chemical exposure. And yet that's just like the physiological side of it. From the like emotional, social, psychosocial identity side of it, this is all having an enormous effect on your hormone balances and your hormone levels and your testosterone versus your estrogen and that whole cycle. And so I do believe that there is a biological component to gender identity. I'm not sure that's true for everyone. And there I think are people who would advocate that there's just a greater fluidity and acceptance of this new cultural norm that champions or allows people to be more comfortable in their new identities. And maybe that's true to a certain extent, but I definitely think that part of the rise that we're seeing in more gender fluidity is related to environmental.
I agree. I think that, and to your point, I think that more tolerance is a good thing. Like having a culture of empathy and tolerance for all beings is a good thing. But still having the discernment to determine, like, okay, yeah, I accept you for who you are, and at the same time, I wouldn't wish any sort of like environmental toxins on my offspring causing any sort of gender related issues of any kind, right? Or any issues of any kind. So it's more around just like the acronym purity, right? Like we're trying to optimize for fertility. You got to factor in all these conditions that we're in. And it seems like the evidence suggests that the majority of us, if not all of us, have these phthalates in our system almost all the time. And certainly people are having them in their system in early development of fetus. And so in that early stage, while there's hormone cascades releasing, testosterone and telling a fetus to develop sex organs that are male, if those endocrine disruptors are suppressing the release of that testosterone and you're getting under masculine or not fully masculinized fetuses and children and ultimately men, then the downstream effects of that seem like, it's playing out. I think we're just seeing how it's playing out because we've been seeing these environmental toxins going into the environment for, plastics revolution was in the 50s. So of course, these generations have just been, and like you were saying, there's kind of these cumulative effects from generation to generation, specifically with males,
Yeah. I don't necessarily think it always manifests as a physiological abnormality or difference, though. I think that's part of the complex issue. I think sometimes it can just be like a social identity issue based on the hormone levels within the body that may not have an external like physiological change. And I think that as there seems to be a rising prevalence of gender fluidity or dysphoria, or, whatever term you'd like to choose, that there is also kind of a normalization for people who are going through normal hormonal fluctuation in their puberty, their essentially their pubescent period, that is a very that's I won't say traumatic, but there's a lot of change going on hormonally as you start releasing gonadotropin hormone and start producing sperm and become a man essentially. There's a lot going on there, and I think 30, 40 years ago you went and did whatever you did and you identified however you identified, but it wasn't there was less normalization of gender fluidity, and so you didn't tend to glom onto that or identify with that. And so I think there's kind of twofold things going on there. I do think that there is some environmental component, and I also think within the pubescent period there's just emotional social angst that can sometimes be misidentified in certain cases to the cultural trend of the time, that the cultural trend may actually be rooted in some sort of environmental or biosocial.
I do, and I think there's a feedback loop here where basically the environment is upstream of our biology, which is upstream of our psychology. So you're ending up with psychology that's emerging from biology that's impacted by an environment that's full of phthalates, right? And so, but then the culture is downstream of our collective psychology in some sense. So basically now the culture is adapting and creating more acceptance and tolerance for so many more individuals who are coming out identifying like this and whatnot, which then feeds back into, I would say, in a way, it's sort of feeding the problem, because it's creating now the answer isn't, hey, let's, and of course, I'm not saying be intolerant of any person. That's not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying is I see the answer as being more like, hey, how the hell do I make sure that I optimize my my health and fertility in conception and raising a child that's as healthy as possible and has, if it's a male, every chance of being a healthy male, right?
Sure. I think the one caveat there is that there's an assumption then that there is a problem, and that that gender fluidity is a bad thing, or that there's some sort of
it's not it's not that I'm saying that there's, first of all, I think that we all have equal humanity, and that my philosophy, just in a real nutshell, is that we're all just expressions of God witnessing itself. So I don't think that anyone is better than anyone else in that sense. So I'm not putting anyone down or anything like that. What I'm saying is, in the same way that you wouldn't smoke, right? Because when you're pregnant, because you want a healthy child, right? We don't see drinking from plastic bottles as smoking, but you're doing the same fucking thing. It's the same thing. It's not not the same thing as smoking, but it's the same impact to, it's a non-optimal input into the fertility equation. So if I'm getting phthalates in my body at the time of conception and early utero, and this is having an impact in the masculinization of a male child, then that's a permanent thing. That's just a permanent thing he's going to have now for the rest of his life. And I think we're just in an environment now, in a culture now, and in a couple of generations now, of humans who have been born under those circumstances and those conditions. And so I think that the cultural kind of zeitgeist around gender that's all kind of weird right now, and fluid, as you say, is downstream of all of those environmental conditions. And I don't think that it's just what it is. And I think love everyone, accept everyone, and also recognize that, like, this isn't the best set of circumstances. Like, we could have a clean environment and hopefully no or very little in the way of sex change operations, because those seem like very permanent traumatic kind of experiences. And I wouldn't wish that on my child, is all I'm trying to get at,
I think there is, an emotional and social challenge to that experience that I can't begin to personally understand, but I can imagine that it's fraught. And so, like, passing the judgment about like whether or not some of my actions might predispose my offspring to that, and having a judgment about like that may be disadvantageous for them or more challenging for them. I'm a little hesitant to do that, but I can also see from like a fertility coach point of view, like, yes, that is another way that we are continually sub-optimizing our future fertility for the subsequent generations, because it's a very real fact that for human reproduction, it takes two distinct sexes, a male and a female sex, to procreate. And so like there isn't a whole lot of like ambiguity in that in my mind. And so I think that the way that if we want to be custodian stewards of the planet, it makes sense to try to live in a way and a lifestyle that really at least provides that option for a future humanity through the perpetuation of like a distinct male and female sex.
It's a lot. It's a lot to.
It's a lot. It's a complex topic, and it also just for like people experiencing gender fluidity, I want to just be very clear that like it's not necessarily something you did or your parents did. It could have been something your grandparents did, or it could have been something that your parents did unwittingly. It could have been something they were not exposed to. It could only be playing a micro percentage of your experience. It's not going to be true across the board for everyone, but it is playing a role in the larger scheme, in my eyes and in my belief. And I want to just like say that with as much grace as possible, and also just to say that like there's no fingers to point for blame other than just like the chemical industry.
It's like
really.
I was saying it's the same as smoking, that's an unfair statement. It's more like it's the same as smoking in 1950 when doctors were telling you smoking was great. You know what I mean? Like we're all in this paradigm. There's a shift starting to happen where people are starting to realize, holy shit, all this stuff is really bad for us. And that's all I meant, is that, we're all we're just in it, and it's, have compassion and some give yourself some grace, because it's a hard one to navigate. As I'm trying to like, this was a big obstacle for me to overcome in the way of like the mindset component of what we're talking about, being motivated and inspired to try for having children. You really have to get over this hump of like, oh my God, everything's fucked, So I'm just pointing to that, I guess. But Josh, this has been rad, and it's been quite deep. I mean, this has been a fun conversation. I've learned a lot. If people want to work with you, if people want to go deeper with this, if they want to make this more customized and tailored to their particular situation in their lives, I'd imagine that's what you do. So like, point people to where they can learn more.
Yeah, the best place is probably my website. It's just Mandrake. So that's the name of my business, Mandrake, MANDRAKE.health. That's the whole website. So mandrake.health. You can also find me on Instagram. I'm not super prevalent on Instagram because it's super short form content. And as you can see, I kind of like to go deep on the science. So appreciate this podcast with you, and looking forward to some more podcasts coming up. And check me out on my website. You can contact me there. You can see the different offerings. I'm working on a DIY digital course that will allow people to go through this stuff self-paced. I also offer like a men's group program, so you can do this in a group. And then I do
that's dope, man. And I'd love to drop in with you on a more a private one-on. I mean, we are doing this one-on-one, but obviously this is like me trying to make this more generalized so people can benefit. But I also have some kind of more specific questions in relationship to my situation and how to sequence my next steps, right? Like I'm kind of, I would say, nearing the end of this sort of study portion of my fertility prep. And now I'm going more into scheduling some tests and going to get some, I want to get feedback from those and take some actions from there. I've already taken some steps in cutting things out that I know I need to do, like the alcohol, cannabis, and things like that. But anyways, I'd love to follow this up with something more like a conversation in that regard. And I have one final question for you, which is a little bit more philosophical, if you're down for it. What's the world in which you want your child to grow up in?
Back to that thing of like reversing the nihilism to find the joy and the beauty, huh? It's I'll cop to being kind of a long time fan of dystopian sci-fi. So sometimes I have to kind of like let that stuff slide and pretend like I didn't read all those great books about the dystopian future we're headed towards. But when I really think about it, it's resilient communities with decentralized global currency, and it's regenerative ag based. It's bioplants and bioplastics. It's one of my champions and heroes in this world is a guy, John Todd. He's the inventor of ecological design in many ways and living machines and this whole idea of like regenerative ecological design. So that's kind of my next life, I think. Maybe when I retire from Mandrake, I may start that business. But it's humans as generating these gorgeous ecologically built mushroom based houses, and I'm a fan of like mycelium architecture and bioaquatic filtration systems and all that stuff. So I'm a huge I got a big place in my like future heart for all of those techs. Kind of, I don't know if there's like some, I'm trying to remember the name, there's like some great geodesic, like bioceramic geodesic dome companies coming out, and like there's some really cool innovative ecotech that I'm excited about. And for my daughter, it's a world where she can choose the man of her dreams and not have to worry that he's that she can have kids with him. And so that looks like it's crazy. I mean, my daughter's only 1 and she'll be 23 in 2045, and she'll be whatever, like,
Yeah.
It's crazy. All the dates suddenly compound when you have a kid and you realize they're going to be alive in 2100. That seems so far away. Like, oh wait, my daughter's going to be alive, hopefully, in 2100.
It really ties you to the future.
Ties you to the future in a really beautiful way. So I'm rooting for like all sorts of awesome ecotech and all the stuff. I have no idea what it is. The rate of change is hopefully headed towards like biomimicry.
I love that, man. We've got a lot of common ground here, and I'd love to have another conversation with you in the future, just off of this, just a launch pad from this, this little cliffhanger. There's so much juice there to unpack, and the decentralized component of the resilient communities is really a cool meme that I'd love to explore more on this podcast as well. So anyways, dude, this has been a ton of fun. Thank you so much.
Cheers. Thanks for having me, Christian. Yeah, it's
much love, man.
I really appreciate it.